And welcome back to Regaining the Balance. This is Matt again. We're doing part 5 of the Bhagavad Gita line for line commentary by Yogananda. And without further ado, the sound sounds good. So let us first, let's see here, share the screen, I think. I need to find it. Yes, there it is. Okay. Hold on just one moment, and here we go. And yet again, Yogananda.org, the Self-Realization Fellowship, and wanted to give that shout out because this is, their publication. And if you guys are interested in more meditation techniques and various other things, definitely check them out. So let's get to the book. Here we go. Right where we left off. And make sure I can see the chat. Here we go. All right. So, yoga, a remedy for doubt, confusion, and intellectual dissatisfaction. Verse 39. The ultimate wisdom of Sankhya I have explained to thee, but now thou must hear about the wisdom of yoga, equipped with which, O Partha, Arjuna, thou shalt shatter the bonds of karma. Having received instruction about the sublime wisdom of self-realization, Sankhya, the devotee must then learn about the secret celestial route of yoga by which self-realization can be attained, the way that leads out of the prison of karma. When by yoga the ego is united to the soul and the soul to the spirit, the ego loses its delusion of being a mortal whose actions are governed by the law of karma. All right, everything looks good. The wisdom of the cosmos is knowledge of 24 principles of nature in interplay with spirit. All inference, perception, and understanding about creation are explained in Sankhya philosophy. Yoga is the science or techniques for practicing realization of the philosophical truth of Sankhya. The word yoga signifies union, mergence. When the soul of man unites with the spirit, the union is described as yoga. This yoga is the goal of every truth seeker. Anyone who practices an effective technique to maintain this supreme union is a yogi. And as you can see, he's not making necessarily differentiations on different practices, because there's lots of different things that could be easily considered yoga. So, and we'll get into that more in the future once we've done with this incredibly long book. Realizing the theoretical Sankhya by practical yoga has a definite meaning. The yogi involves, quote unquote, creation, reverses the 24 evolutionary processes of nature as expounded in Sankhya, starting with matter, the grossest form of creation, and proceeding through the linked chain of 24 primordial qualities, whose origin is spirit, the involution of the 24 principles of creation. By ascent of the consciousness through the subtle centers of life and spiritual awakening in the spine, the yogi learns the inner science of changing the consciousness of gross matter into the consciousness of its primordial principles. He resolves the 5 vibratory elements along with their manifestations of the 5 senses, 5 organs of action, 5 life forces, from grosser to finer principles, changing the consciousness of vibratory earth into the consciousness of vibratory water, the consciousness of water into that of vibratory fire, the consciousness of fire into that of vibratory air, the consciousness of air into that of vibratory ether, and the consciousness of ether into that of mind, sense consciousness or manas, the consciousness of mind into that of discrimination, buddhi, and the consciousness of discrimination into that of ego, ahamkara, the consciousness of ego into that of feeling, chitta. By thus dissolving the 24 principles successfully into one another, the yogi then merges the consciousness of the feeling into that of this primordial cosmic vibratory force, Om, and the consciousness of Om into spirit. He thereby reaches the ultimate unity, the one from whom has sprung the many. By gradual steps, the yogi in this way converts all consciousness of matter into the consciousness of spirit. The realization is not attainable through either reason or imagination, but solely through intuitive experience. Such experience is, in nearly all cases, the result of practicing meditation and yoga techniques as taught by the great sages of ancient and modern India. The poet or philosopher may imagine this cosmos to be the only mind, but that imagination cannot help him overcome death and attain immortality. The yogi, on the other hand, wins an unshakable knowledge that all matter is spirit by daily employing a technique that uproots from his mind all the delusions implanted in it by Maya, the cosmic delusive force. He thus beholds the universe as a dream of God, a dream from which one awakens only when he is conscious of the omnipresent spirit. Anyone who uses the yoga techniques is a yogi practitioner, but he who attains the final union with spirit is a perfected yogi. Self-realization consists in experiencing the different states of intuitive consciousness attained by meditation that lead to this ultimate union. Sankhya Yoga philosophy, therefore, is not only analytical and discriminative knowledge of the cosmos, but includes definite methods for self-realization. By Sankhya Yoga, the yogi perceives the exact nature of his body, mind, and soul, as well as of the cosmos in its entirety. Through scientific techniques, he attains by gradual steps the knowledge of the ultimate substance of creation. Without yoga, no devotee can know the true character of all forces in nature, in cosmic vibration, and in spirit. Yoga cauterizes, quote-unquote, the brain cell grooves in which past tendencies are hidden. By the moral discipline of yoga, right action in renouncing desires, that is, karma yoga, and the use of technique of meditation, which is Raja Yoga, and Raja means royal, the devotee gradually frees himself from experiencing over and over again the fruits of his past actions and stored up tendencies. This is true. I definitely would like to reiterate that. He learns to destroy the stored up seeds of his life and all of his previous existences. The devotee who knows the art of yoga, experiencing the pure joy of meditation, does not further involve himself in new desires and new karma. And by yoga techniques, the cosmic energy cauterizes the brain cell grooves in which the past tendencies are hidden. Yoga practice, therefore, not only prevents the formation of new karma-making desires, but also scientifically frees the devotee from impending karma, nearly ripe fruits of past actions. And this is yet again another, if you look on the Christian side of things, this is one of the reasons, and if you really look deeply into these things, this is one of the reasons why Christ talks about forgiveness all the time, because when he talks about that, he's talking about it in a much more cosmic, karmic way, rather than I just forgive you because I'm the better man type of deal, So I just throwing that out there. Continuing, every individual acts partially with free choice and partially under influences from past tendencies. That's correct. The latter appears as psychological biases that modify and prejudice man's power of free will. The predominating tendencies of good or evil in a child have their roots in his past life. Every truth seeker should analyze himself to discover the extent to which his free will is guided by the dictates of his past tendencies, which appear now as octopus-like habits. The daily events of one's life tend to resurrect in man's subconscious mind and his ancient habits of response, good or bad, to external stimuli. Different individuals have different quote-unquote fates. The sense-enslaved man is guided largely by his habits of the past. His free will is meager. He is permeated with desires, whether able or not to fulfill them. The spiritual man, on the other hand, has freed himself from all worldly desires springing from past life seeds and has thus redeemed from bondage his free will. The ordinary man eclipses his free will with dark shadows of the past. The spiritual man, ever watchful for freedom, safeguards it by meditation. When the will is free, it vibrates in harmony with the infinite. Man's will is then God's will. Blind renunciation of material objects does not ensure freedom. It is by enjoying the bliss of spirit in meditation and by comparing it with the lesser joy of the senses that the devotee becomes eager to follow the spiritual path. I can't agree with that anymore. Verse 40, in this path of yoga action, there is no loss of the unfinished efforts of realization, nor is there creation of contrary effects. Even a tiny bit of this real religion protects one from great fear, the colossal sufferings inherent in the repeated cycles of birth and death. Yoga is the path of spiritual action, the infallible means by which concept is transmuted into realization. For those who embrace this, quote, real religion, unquote, there is no waste of any holy effort. The least attempt will be to their lasting benefit. Mathematically certain, right spiritual endeavor to reach God produces only salutary results, whereas material pursuits are like wandering in blind alleys, risking encounters with their unseen hazards. And I'd like to also throw this out. One of the big problems I've always had growing up as Christian is that they don't really ever teach you how to pray. It's bow your head and then ask God for things. But those things end up being all physical kind of things. You're not asking for knowledge. You're not asking for connection. You're not asking for, the things that actually are real. But you're, employing this divine injunction on physical stuff. It's no wonder people get so disillusioned with this, with this kind of thing, because there's no real method of connection, and it's one of the big problems I have with Christianity. And even as a Catholic, I just taught myself how to pray the Rosary, which is how I learned how to meditate originally. But nobody taught me. There was no programs. It wasn't like a thing widespread. It was strange. And so when I look around the world, I see there's so many different religions, definitely, and different spiritual practices. This is a big part of it, and it would be nice to see Christians kind of break out and learn a little something, and not necessarily stray away from their religion, but learn to utilize these methods to connect deeper into it. So I don't know. Continuing, poignant reminders about that is, hold on. Yes, poignant reminders abound that it is a surer protection to live under the canopy of truth than to expose oneself on the open fields of error. Even a little practice of the divine method of yoga will bring relief from the dire disease of ignorance and its sufferings. The last sentence of this Gita verse was often quoted by Mahavatar Babaji in referring to Kriya Yoga. Herein is a message of encouragement to devotees who have entered the spiritual path, have not yet achieved any noticeable progress. In the material world, all successes are known by their tangible, though often short-lasting results. But in the spiritual path, all results, being primarily psychological, are intangible. They are real, nonetheless, and everlastingly beneficial. Spiritual results begin as the subtle transformations in the consciousness of the inner being. They are to be measured according to their peace-giving qualities. When a devotee meditates deeply, he is bound to feel an ever-increasing peace, which, after all, is more precious than any worldly possession. To maintain the peace within, in spite of the ever-changing circumstances of life, is to be happier than a king, who, amid outwardly favorable circumstances, may be inwardly miserable. When a devotee advances very far, this inner peace becomes the consciousness of omnipresence, omniscience, and omnipotence. The devotee then controls the switch that runs the factory of cosmic creation. Right methods of meditation never produce harmful results. Another interpretation of this stanza is that the correct practice of true yoga can never produce harmful effects. Whereas certain formal religious rites calculated to give specific powers as described in various scriptural texts may produce no results or wrong results if performed with even the slightest inaccuracy. This point is illustrated in a story in the Puranas. An inept practitioner of mantra yoga incantations was trying out the efficacy of certain vibratory seed words in order to destroy his enemy, but because he renounced them wrongly, he turned that power against himself instead. The word peace, for instance, normally produces a peaceful effect, but if one says the same word loudly and angrily, the result is not peace, but disturbance. Certain vibratory sounds, known as oculists, produced by proper pronunciation, a specific good or malefic result. The slightest mistake, however, may give rise to results opposite to those expected. And yes, so I have someone in the chat is asking what's good introduction to yoga. I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of yoga out there. I would stray away from any of the Western style stuff. One thing I could definitely say, I mean, I would, maybe check out some of the programs of Yogananda.org. They have a bunch of online stuff. They have beginner courses. If you're enjoying this book, I would definitely say check that out. But there's also various other yoga practices. So you really have to kind of play around to see what really works for you. But it's and that's true for anybody. I mean, for me, I just kind of bounced around in a lot of ways. The things I needed kind of fell in my lap when I wanted them to fall in my lap, or I needed them to. But everyone is different. So it's one of those things where his organization has been around for a very long time, and they definitely have some pretty, their programs have, I think, barely changed. So I'd say check them out. But there's so many other ones. There's if you want to check out someone else on YouTube, there's someone named Sadhguru on YouTube, SAD Guru, and he is more of the a Shiva worshiper, or devotee, I should say. But he's great to listen to, and he also has a couple of different places and things, resources as far as meditation and stuff goes. So poke around and start practicing and start to meditate and all that kind of stuff, and use your intuition to feel what's best for you. So there you go, buddy. Okay, so continuing, the incantator of our story was an avowed enemy of the god Indra, planning to destroy Indra by psychic means. He was performing a prescribed ritual, but was unwittingly intoning, quote, Indra's enemy, unquote, instead of, quote, Indra the enemy, unquote, thus changing by mispronunciation the entire direction of the vibratory power set in motion. By uttering, quote, Indra's enemy, unquote, he was unknowingly designating himself as the victim. The incantation operated as accordance with his words, not his intention. At the end of the ceremony, it was not Indra, but Indra's enemy who lay dead. The devotee should understand that at the worst, it is dangerous, and at its best, it is spiritually worthless to meddle with psychic phenomena and powers or with ceremonial rituals of uncertain or limited results. In following the spiritual path of right action and the right methods of meditation for the purpose of realizing God, there is no waste of any spiritual toil, and all efforts are divinely rewarded. Right methods of meditation can never produce untoward results. Wrong method, of course, are not beneficial, whether in meditation or in anything else. Charlatans occasionally devise strange methods which they prudently fail to practice themselves, but which they recommend to their followers to impress and mystify them. Some misled or unbalanced people following wrong techniques, such as violent breathing exercises or other deviations from the pure science of meditation, have found themselves in trouble. Citing these aberrant examples as uninformed people then look with suspicion even on true salvation-giving yoga techniques. Yeah, so he's being kind of, he's from the Sankhya and Swami school of Shankara. And, there are definitely different kinds of yoga out there for sure. When it comes to these kind of techniques, like, for instance, the violent breathing exercise. I mean, that's, if you know anything about Kundalini yoga, there's this thing called breath of fire, which is a very, very, like, the stomach, very violent breathing exercise. But it enlivens this, like, energy in your body. So, he's not being all that specific about this, but you can tell he's throwing shade on some other people that he doesn't necessarily think are true. But continuing, great masters who have realized God have taught the spiritual methods and techniques that lead to God realization and liberation. As pure sugar can never taste bitter, so divine techniques of meditation, such as Kriya Yoga, can produce nothing but the sweetness of peace and infinite blessings and ultimate God contact. Saints have declared that if a person even once really desired salvation, that desire is firmly planted in the superconscious mind. No matter how long ignored, it will germinate when favorable opportunity arises, whether in this life or in a later incarnation. So the devotee should remember that even a momentary entry into the kingdom of meditation may ultimately mean his freedom from the karmic prisons of births and deaths. Someday, some life, each man must take that very first divine step. Yep, I agree. The power of sincere desire for God. This stanza does not mean, of course, that a little meditation will ensure freedom from cosmic delusion. The Gita simply points out that it is far better to start on the path of eternal safety by meditation than to remain on the death-ending material plane of thought. If even the mere desire of liberation ultimately leads one to liberation, as the sage promises, it is obvious that determined, steady efforts at meditation must immensely quicken one's spiritual evolution. Until the desire for liberation is first awakened in the heart and fulfilled by meditation, salvation is impossible even though one passes through innumerable incarnations. Oh, we got to another chapter. Okay. I'm pretty sure we read all this at some point. Verse 41. In this yoga, O scion of Kuru, Arjuna, the inner determination is single and one-pointed, whereas the reasonings of the undecided mind are unending and variously ramified. The yogi focuses his mind on God and on naught else. Undecided dreamers dissipate their mental powers in the confusion of endless, many-branched pathways of interest and desires. The yogi reaches the great goal of his life. The restless person wanders incessantly in the labyrinths of successive births and deaths, unable to find fulfillment. The Gita points out the difference between the meditating devotee who is intent on finding God and the restless individual who is content with theoretical teachings. A curiosity seeker pursues haphazardly numerous paths of philosophy and religion, but in his newfound views and beliefs he stumbles constantly over doubts and dissatisfaction. The yogi, on the other hand, having fixed his discrimination and concentration on a single goal, God bliss, begins to quickly prove through his own inner awakening the divine reality. The self-realized devotee, having reached God, finds that the thirst of his desires of many incarnations becomes quenched at once. He is released from all reincarnation-making desires. But the curiosity seeker, ever indecisive and uncommitted, remains tangled in his fancies and complex of desires. Fettered by karma, he is forced to incarnate again and again. The spiritual aspirant needs to forsake indecision. Following one true guru preceptor and one definite path, he will save himself from endless roaming. Many persons do not take religion seriously. They consider it a matter of intellectual speculation or emotional stimulation. New philosophical theories engage their immediate interests. They ignore any practice of the ancient, the time-proven truths. He who considers a spiritual path of discipline to be outmoded and useless because it lacks the appeal of emotional and intellectual novelty will always be traveling in new lanes and strange bypaths, never arriving at the final destination of divine blessedness. The real spiritual aspirant, single-pointed on God alone, quickly recognizes a true guru and a true path of self-realization. He occupies his time with the guru-given technique of meditation that leads to God. Thus, without difficulty, steadfast in his aim, he reaches the pinnacle of spiritual emancipation. A chronic wanderer in the path of theology seldom tastes even a sip of the pure divine waters of truth. He craves only newly flavored ideational concoctions. He craves only newly flavored ideational concoctions. There you go. This desire for untired novelties merely leads one into a desert tract of intellectual doubts. The God-thirsty individual is busy drinking the nectar of joy in God. Verses 42 to 44. O Partha Arjuna, no single-pointed resolution, no fixity of mind, in the meditative state of samadhi grows in those who cling tenaciously to power and sense delights, and whose discriminative intelligence is led astray by the flowery declinations of the spiritually ignorant, contending that there is naught else than to rejoice in the laudatory aphorisms of the Vedas, their true nature being afflicted with earthly inclinations, having given the pleasurable phenomena of the astral world as their highest goal, performing the numerous specific artificial rites for the purpose of obtaining enjoyment and power. Such persons embrace instead the cause of new births, the consequence of these desire-instigated actions. Those who are attached to sense pleasures and powers, whether of the material world or astral in nature, cannot gain the mental equilibrium of meditation. They fail to receive God or union with God through ecstasy, samadhi. Misled by the precious words of the unenlightened, desire-infected and paradise-loving, eagerly scanning the scriptures about a, quote, profitable, unquote, heaven, rejoicing in the rhetoric of Holy Writ and exuberant in performing outer ceremonies that promises gifts of pleasure and power, here and in the hereafter, such men lose all of their spiritual discrimination and seek no higher aspirations. Their actions, filled with desire, sow inexorable seeds of births and deaths. These inner delusions prevent man from tuning in with the cosmic consciousness, ecstatic union with God, as a radio may register the static of various atmospheric conditions and thus be prevented from clearly receiving a broadcasting program. So the man who is filled with the static of material desires, including those masquerading as spiritual aspirations, cannot fine-tune his inner radio to the one-pointed samadhi state of God consciousness. These delusions, or psychological static of desires, arise from attachment to power and sense pleasures. The devotee should avoid undiscriminating belief in the superficially convincing words of the unwise. He is advised to guard his spiritual discrimination, lest it be stolen by the sophistry of those who espouse the philosophy of sensory aggrandizement, and those who are pleasure mongers or seekers of psychic and astral powers. The devotee should concentrate not on astral phenomena or miraculous powers, but only on the attainment of joy in God. The Gita also warns the devotee against desires for the pleasures and engrossing phenomena of the astral heaven as the highest goal. Nor should he desire a heaven after death that is nothing more than a glorified place for sense pleasures. Heaven is not a, quote, happy hunting ground, unquote, a land where without satiety, earthly sense pleasures will continue to be enjoyed. He who desires any other heaven than oneness with God, the very source of bliss, is in delusion. A man is also caught in delusion if he concentrates on the employment of scriptural rites and sacrificial rituals for material rewards. The evanescent pleasures and supernatural abilities that may be attained by the literal performance of the deeply symbolic Vedic or other scriptural rites. These delusions, based on desires for enhanced forms of pleasure and grandiose powers of fragment and singularity of desire for God. Grandiose power, fragment, the singularity. Okay, sorry, I'm going to go back and read that again. These delusions, based on desires for enhanced forms of pleasure and grandiose powers, fragment the singularity of desire for God. Being of matter and not of spirit, the karmic fruits of these desires are planted not in liberation, but in the soil of compulsory rebirth, a dire consequence the true yogi longs to avoid. An individual might reason thus, quote, since I do not bear any burden of knowing what I was before this life, nor what I shall be afterwards, why should I fear various births and deaths, unquote. It is true that man's ego is embodied only once under one personality and form, but although the ego successfully relinquishes the individualities of its incarnations, it yet carries within subconscious chambers the pleasures and terrors of the experiences of all past lives. Each man feels within himself many subterranean fears that are rooted in dark experiences of lives long forgotten. Those who spend their earthly sojourns in emotionally reacting to the endless dream pictures of life continue to behold turbulent dream pictures of death and new incarnations. Until such men abandon their search for a paradise of pleasures in the emotional dream drama, lured by the specious promises of the flowery enticements of the senses, they cannot merge in the changeless, everlasting blessedness behind the fanciful tumult of change. By deep samadhi meditation, the haunting specter of man's inexplicable fears are eradicated, along with the many mandatory rebirths. And I will say this, that it is true. When you start to break down, when you start to separate what you thought was you and what you end up realizing is you, you have an entire, let's just say, emotional baggage will just fall from you, and you won't ever think about it again. And it truly is a very freeing experience. And it does, everyone's different. Some people can really hit that fast. Some people need a lot longer time to be able to work towards that through meditation. But once you get there, there's no going back. That's all I can say. At least in my opinion, I'll never go back. Verse 45, the Vedas are concerned with the three universal qualities or gunas. O Arjuna, free thyself from the triple qualities and from the pairs of opposites, ever calm, harboring no thoughts of receiving and keeping. Become thou settled in the self. This is an important chapter, actually. Quote, the Vedas praise and worship the activating forces of nature that spume her many forms from the royal and of the trifold qualities. But, O devotee, concentrate your attention not on matter, but on spirit, and thus free yourself from emotional involvement in nature's dream pictures of good, active, and evil existence. Ever adherent to your true nature, nitya sattva, I'm not going to read that. Okay, so ever adherent to your true nature, quiescent, and now that just stumbled me. I can't even read anymore. Undisturbed by the triadic qualities and their light and shadow, pairs of opposites, free from the delusion-woven nets of desires and attachments, become permanently established in your transcendent self. Unquote. Let's see here. External rites may bestow powers, but not liberation. The stanza points out the spiritual The stanza points out the spiritual inefficacy of the practice, however perfect and austere, of the merely external rites mentioned in the scriptures. Nothing but the cleansing of man's inward being has the power to free him from the trifold reincarnation making qualities of human nature, the sattvic, elevating, rajasic, activating, and tamasic, degrading. Many Vedic scriptures, profoundly symbolic and carrying hidden meanings not apparent to the superficial scholar, also possesses external significance as rites and rituals for merely worldly purposes. Some Vedic stanzas on the surface are concerned with methods for developing the rajasic or activating qualities of man for definite results, such as victory in battle over one's enemies or making mundane life healthful or profitable or progressive. Other Vedic verses tell of the development of tamasic qualities, powers and acquisitions that feed man's vanity and base nature. Still others deal with the culture of sattvic qualities, those that sweeten and ennoble a man. The ordinary devotee who understands only the surface import of the Vedas and who blindly follow the literal instructions is unaware of the truth that any man who concerns himself primarily with the phenomenal world of the three qualities is thereby subject to reincarnation through the strength of associated desires. If, for instance, a man employs certain Vedic chants in order to triumph over an enemy, his successes in that aim will establish in his consciousness a desire for the power of future victories. This subconscious desire leads to the development of the activating, rajasic quality in the devotee, and is the direct cause of another rebirth in which he must work out the unfulfilled desire. Any desire develops in a man one or more of the three qualities, elevating, activating, or degrading, and ties him to the wheel of reincarnation. The word Veda signifies knowledge. The Vedas, the, quote, divinely revealed, unquote, most highly revered Hindu scriptures are books of wisdom, both material and spiritual. A scripture is meant primarily for the liberation of the soul from the bondage of rebirth, and secondly, for teaching the art of success in material life. Excuse me. Certain classes of people blindly worship the Vedas and consider all their injunctions to be observed literally as divine prescription essential to liberation. Isn't this interesting? And we'll finish this part and make a comment. The authors of these ancient treatises were wise enough to stimulate interest in the scriptures by showing the general populace ways of material success and then to try to lead them on to follow those self-disciplinary rules that end in spiritual liberation. Now, isn't this interesting here? Certain classes of people blindly worship the Vedas and consider all their injunctions to be observed literally as divine prescriptions essential to liberation. And that's very funny because this is how most religions in the world have this exact same thing happen to them. They start off with this idealistic way of trying to help people, and then it just devolves into people who are just like, every word is literally the word as you're supposed to take it, and it's one of the issues that a lot of evangelicals have, and I think it's a problem because it's clear what he's just saying here. The authors of these ancient treatises were wise enough to stimulate interest in the scriptures by adding in some of these things, but at the same time, these things became the religion itself and not the higher side of things, and I think this is. This is definitely. We are all in the war of Kurukshetra at the moment, in an almost worldwide scale. So it's important to keep your wits about you, because the more you do that, the better decisions you'll make. The more people you'll be able to wake up as well, because the calmer you are when you talk to people, it's harder for them to get upset at you for being an asshole, or excuse my language. But yeah, it's kind of like that. And lately I've been having more success getting into people's heads, especially about all this stuff going on. But it takes real patience. I have a friend of mine I've worked with many times, and he once told me I had godlike patience, in which I laughed. I said, it's not that hard. And it isn't, but in meditation, when you start to realize how, connected we really truly are, it's really hard to get upset at people when you realize that they're dealing with an innumerable amount of, thought constructs that they've built their life upon. And it's hard to break those down. And so one has to be gentle when one does that. but it's not impossible to change people's minds. It just takes patience and intuition. So keep that in mind, guys. We can all do this. It's starting to turn the tide, I think. So at least where I'm kind of starting to see it. Continuing, Gita advises a calm desirelessness to free man from bondage. It's funny, that's exactly what I was just saying. The Gita, the quintessence of the path to liberation, advises the devotee to free himself from any activities that rouses the reincarnation-making threefold human qualities, and to develop instead the desireless intuitive state by right meditation. He who receives the freely given all-sufficient blessings and guidance of God in divine inner communion need not propitiate the lesser quote-unquote gods of natural forces who extract a karmic fee for favors. By remaining ever calm, a natural sequel to deep meditation, the sincere devotee frees himself from the sway of the pairs of opposite qualities coexisting with the triad of gunas, good and bad, virtue and vice, happiness and sorrow, heat and cold, like and dislike, and so forth. When man develops one quality, he is automatically required to experience its opposite. One who has pain looks for happiness. One who has happiness is afraid of losing it. The tranquil, even balanced state of mind that cannot be disturbed by pain or happiness leads the devotee to the unchangeable, ever-new joy hidden in the soul. Materially minded people shun this philosophy because they are afraid of a tasteless, colorless existence. They are so used to clinging to the buffeted draft of delusive, mundane hopes, they do not know that reality, unending joy, lies in attuning the consciousness to its true, ever-calm soul nature by meditation, and in thus preventing the mind from riding on the crests of sorrow and happiness, or from sinking to the depths of indifference. The gain of temporary happiness is followed by its loss, thus increasing one's misery. Therefore, the devotee is advised to liberate himself from all exciting qualities and to concentrate on the bliss nature of the soul. Further, the soul's superconsciousness should become anchored on the immutable rock of cosmic consciousness where no waves of change make any impression. The devotee should remove all forms of conditioned existence that stimulate desires and attachments. The frantic consciousness of getting and holding on to objects. His goal should be unconditioned existence in God. Excuse me. I'll need to take a quick drink here. Pardon me. Oh God, coffee's so good. Okay, esoteric interpretation of Vedas according to yoga. Great yogis have a spiritual interpretation of the Vedas and their injunctions. The exoteric division of the Vedas is that which deals with rituals, the esoteric with knowledge. The outer surface of the body and the nerve centers that stimulate sensory motor activity are compared to the exoteric ceremonial rites of the Vedas. The inner subtle astral centers and higher states of consciousness correspond to the esoteric principles of the Vedas. The yogis say that the meditating devotee on his way to the perception of the self rises above the consciousness of the world, the senses, and the body, the Vedic rituals, and become concentrated on the spinal region and its subtle spiritual center of consciousness and vital energy, the Vedic esoteric principles. The devotee is then counseled to rise above the perceptions of the coccygeal, sacral, and lumbar regions, corresponding to the three lower Vedas that deal with the material side of life, and to concentrate on the regions of the dorsal, cervical, medullary, and cerebral centers, corresponding to the Rig Veda, the highest and most spiritual of the Vedas. Verse 46. To the knower of Brahman spirit, all the Vedas, scriptures, are of no more utility than is a reservoir when there is a flood from all directions. The Brahmin, he who possesses the supreme and sacred knowledge, realization of spirit, finds needless any study of the description of God that appear in the scriptures. Even as a reservoir is useless when a flood spreads everywhere, so formal scriptures are superfluous to one who is merged in the infinite sea. At one with the supreme wisdom of spirit, the yogi finds all other forms of knowledge of little consequence. The world's scriptures are superseded by the fullness of direct experience when the devotee has commingled his consciousness in the ocean of God. Jesus said, quote, "But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you." Unquote. Expansion of human consciousness into cosmic consciousness by the art of concentration brings to the devotee a joyous wisdom far greater than the satisfaction of theoretical knowledge, however profound, resulting from the study of books. That devotee is like a man who has been trying all his life to get $1,000 and who suddenly finds himself a billionaire. The yogi who goes into the depths of silence, the kingdom of God within, exactly, finds that as his consciousness and life force begin to withdraw from body consciousness, he soars through the aesthetic tunnel of the spine into the God contact perceptible in the subtle cerebral centers as ever new bliss. Enthroned in this place of joy, enthroned in this palace of joy, the yogi never yearns again for the suffocating slums of sense pleasures. The true devotee may be said to lose desire for Vedic rites, sensory knowledge, when he becomes an omniscient knower of Brahman, spirit. And interestingly enough, Sadhguru on YouTube, S-A-D, Guru, that's something that he says a lot as well. I mean, he's read some things, but he's generally uneducated about a lot of these texts. So he's got a pretty interestingly, he's got a very interesting way of being able to just grab stuff right out of nowhere and elucidate on stuff. He's a fascinating character. I definitely suggest checking him out just for a different perspective. Continuing, the yoga art of right action that leads to infinite wisdom. Thy human right is for activity only, never for the resultant fruit of actions. This is important, you guys. Do not consider thyself the creator of the fruits of thy activities, neither allow thyself attachment to inactivity. The devotee is a divine lark, immersed in the spirit of his song. He has no thought about personal gain or impressing others with his singing. The actions of the devotee are for the infinite alone, not to please mankind or to satisfy his own material desires. Hence, he does not concentrate on expected reward, but is devoted to right action for its own sake, to please his divine beloved, knowing that it is God who has made him an incarnate being with faculties of animation for the purpose of enacting a part in the cosmic drama. The devotee ever recognizes God's image and power within him as the initiator and doer of all actions. As such, he has no claim on, nor can he be held accountable for, the effects of his God-identified activities. But in surrendering to God the fruits of actions, the devotee takes care lest his mind, being denied his accustomed reward, steer him towards apathetic inaction. Thus the Gita expresses the art of wise action by which true happiness and freedom can be attained. This section is how selfish action, withdrawal from action, and spiritually liberating action differ. Men with their differing motives, the result of those motives can be classified in the following way. Number 1. The first group consists of those who live for their own selfish happiness and for no other reason. The self-centered man may acquire wealth by his works and for that reason the respect of his family and others who benefit thereby. But with the approach of death, he is forced to relinquish everything he has treasured. Such people, when it is too late, may discover many types of worldly disillusionment, that happiness does not follow a life of egotistical interests. The intelligent man perceives by reflection that he is not the ultimate creator of actions or duties. Thus, the work assigned to him by God should never be performed merely for self. Those who act for themselves must bear the binding karmic burden of responsibilities for their actions. Human beings should, therefore, play their designated roles, not for the satisfaction of their own egos, but for the working out of the divine plan. This teaching does not mean that human life is mathematically predestined in every way. It simply points out that human beings endowed with free choice and intuition must properly use these faculties to discover and fulfill the duties assigned to them by God. Even though it is difficult for a man to find out what his life's duties are, still, if he seeks God in meditation, the voice of his inner conscience guides him aright. I would 100% agree with that. Whether one's work is that of a corporate executive or managing a household and bringing up a family, such duties fulfill a necessary and noble part in the cosmic scenario. Oh man, I have so much to say about this. Continuing, many people falsely think it is impossible to carry out material endeavors without possessing a motivational personal desire for the fruit of action in the form of success. The truth is that when a person works for his own material gain, he is not so alert, wise, and happy as when he executes his small or large plans to please God. A rich man who accomplishes his business ends only for selfish gain and who considers himself to be the sole creator and owner of his success dreads the thought that he will be dispossessed of everything by death. But if a successful magnate employs his abilities with the consciousness that his accomplishments are for God and use his good fortune for worthy causes and to help those less fortunate, he will find the newly roused attributes of his soul bestowing on him an ever greater enthusiasm for success and joyous inner fulfillment in being able to do more for God's children. Far better this than a hoarding wealth for personal satisfaction, only to have to part with it at the edge of the grave, leaving it generally to unworthy relatives to fight over and squander. Okay, real quick, I just want to say a few things. So, I mean, this is that whole section had so many great points to it, and I think it brings up this idea where there's this kind of like how people look at Christians, for example, they look at the example of Christ and they say to themselves, well, it's impossible for me to be able to live up to that kind of thing and whatever else. And but they're thinking with such a limited mind because it's all these things are innate within us. And how we perceive, like, the three gunas, right? The three qualities, elevating, activating, degrading, are at play in us at all kind of points in time. But if a person really connects and really has this bliss that he's talking about here, one can look at almost everything you do as just an act of devotion, or an act of sacrifice, so to speak. So, for instance, I am a gardener during the summertime. I work for gardening companies. All we do is make gardens. We don't cut grass or anything like that. We make things beautiful with flowers and all kinds of different plants and stuff. And I only started doing this a couple years ago, but I've become quite good at doing it. But one of the things that it's always on my mind when I'm doing it is that when I'm done, the people who will live around it will enjoy it, and it will give them pleasure, and it will give them joy to see something like that in their house. And then the people that walk by, or the visitors that come by and enjoy those things, those are things where, in my mind and where I'm at least in my perspective in my life spiritually, it's those are all things that are just gifts. They're constant gifts to consciousness, to any and all people. And I walk away from these gardens, and a lot of them I never see again, and I don't even think about them. But all the things, when you create life in a way where all things are in a way an act of devotion, and in a way you can bow to things in life, and the recognition that they're all part of you, like, it creates a whole different aspect of life in general, and it improves you. It improves your outlook on life as well. I mean, if you get to that point anyways, your outlook is already changed as it is, because to live like that is something different. And one of the nice things about living like that every day, or striving to, is you do have effect on people, and sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but it's one of those things where you are just yourself, and the closer you are to your own realization, the more power you have on really showing people that there is another way in life, and that they don't have to suffer that way, because you are a living example right in front of their face. So yes, indeed. And sharing is caring said something interesting here. A wise man said to me, God does not answer your question. God gives you questions to answer. And I mean, yeah, life is all about a big question. Why? Why are we here? What is our purpose? I forget. There's something called the 4 questions that are scientists, especially in the field of consciousness, constantly ask that question too. So. Anyway, so continuing, number 2, there is a second class of persons who, through misunderstanding of the spiritual injunctions, think all human activities and ambitions as the outcome of egotism. Hence, in sanctimonious retreat from duty they espouse inactivity. The Gita warns against such a view. Even egotistical activity is better than non-activity. The egotistical performer of his life's duties, giving no credit to God as the originator of all actions, nevertheless does perform his duties. Therefore, he receives divine grace in the form of some good karma and material happiness. But the inactive man who bluntly refuses to work either for egotistical or divine satisfaction is deprived, with a grim justice, of both material and spiritual reward. This is also a warning to all, quote, half-baked, unquote, spiritual aspirants who, in the name of being unattached to the fruits of action, become mentally and physically slothful and idle. Spiritual growth is impossible in the stagnant soil of indolence. Number 3, the third class of being would consist of those who are wise and perform all mundane, moral, and spiritual duties only with a thought of pleasing God. Yeah, that's kind of what I was just saying. When the Gita says not to desire the fruits of action, it does not mean that one should work like an automaton without thought for the probable results of one's activities. The teaching of the Gita is to work intelligently, ambitiously, keenly, try to create the right fruits of actions, not for oneself, but for God and all his children. The devotee who performs all good actions just for God lives on approval and great inner satisfaction without being hurt by failures or overjoyed by successes. When a true devotee meets with some failure in spite of his mathematically laid plans, he is not discouraged, but continuously tries harder for a successful outcome to offer to God. When his efforts are crowned with success, he is not unduly elated or self-congratulatory, but divinely content with the thought that he may have pleased God and served others by his accomplishment. I mean, it's exactly what I was just saying. The ordinary man does not know where he happened to be born in certain family or why he happened to have certain specific duties rather than other duties assigned to him. Realizing his ignorance, the devotee aspirant lays all responsibility on God. He, quote, renounces the personal fruits of actions, unquote. He denies all satisfaction to his human ego that falsely considers itself as the doer, quite crowding God out of the picture. A righteous man who performs his duties to the body, such as eating, bathing, and exercising, and who performs his duty to the mind by educating it and teaching it concentration, and who performs his duties to his soul by meditation, realizes that these activities are aimless and futile except for one purpose, that of attaining God consciousness. Man should think of the body as a divine animal that God has given into his charge. Therefore, he takes proper care of it, i.e., your body is your temple, right? He should harbor beautiful thoughts just because the mind is a temple of the Lord. Man is merely a custodian of that mental temple. He should honor his soul and contact its superconsciousness by meditation just because the soul is an image of the Heavenly Father. The actions of the body, mind, and soul, when performed with egotism, induce one to concentrate on the fruits of actions. These lead to complex karmic reactions and desires which, in turn, give rise to rebirths. But he who lives in and cares for a body, mind, and soul just for God and not for his ego is devoid of all reincarnation-making desires. At death, he is liberated in omnipresence. Therefore, each devotee should perform all duties to the body, mind, and soul by hygienic, thoughtful, and meditative living, avoiding selfishly ambitious activity by being divinely ambitious, and avoiding non-activity which satisfies neither the human ego nor God. Finding one's God-given role in life. Actors on the stage of life who remain inactive or become rebellious throw the divine drama into confusion. In a theater, a man with even a minor role may upset the plot by non-cooperation or by thrusting himself forward against the wishes of the director. In life, similarly, the divine plan is hampered when the actors do not intelligently play the parts assigned to them. When a man tries to find out by meditation what activities he should perform according to the divine plan, he also discovers to his discomfiture that he has to work out many other activities of karmic debt engendered by egotistical desires and actions of former incarnations. If, for example, a man has been a material businessman in a former incarnation and later, through disillusionment with worldly life, attains birth in a spiritual environment, he will nevertheless find that recurrent material desire will crop up in his mind unless he has concurrently cultivated a firm desire for God. He should eliminate the past life material desires by discrimination, saying within himself, quote, "In this life, I will perform only the divine duty of knowing God. I will have no other ambition," unquote. If his mind still does not find satisfaction, he may engage himself in some material activity, thinking, quote, "Since I am impelled by a desire of a former incarnation to carry on a business, I will fulfill the desire this time by working not for the gratification of my egotistical self, but only to please God," unquote. Strong prenatal evil tendencies must not be catered to, but rather severed by the sword of wisdom. If one finds the task beyond him, quote, "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak," unquote, he should daily implore the unfailing aid of God. Anyone who tries sincerely and unceasingly to work out the tendencies of his past incarnations, not for egotistical satisfactions, but for spiritual freedom, finally becomes liberated through not having succumbed to karmic compulsions. The man who tries to work out his past karma with the thought of pleasing the Lord alone ultimately understands the fine distinctions between the duties instigated by his own past egotistical tendencies and the duties assigned by God. Human existence is not predestined. Every man is given free choice to accept the divine plan of existence or to follow the path of ignorance and misery. If people rightly understood this point, utopia would dawn. To summarize the precepts of this stanza, a man is on the right path when he concentrates on the performance of his duties only to please God. He succumbs neither to inactivity, the ego's escape into comfortable lethargy, nor to performance of duty to satisfy egotistical desires, but does his part to fulfill the perfect cosmic plan. Those who work for themselves as the beneficiaries of their actions are continuously led from one desire to another until they become so completely involved that they cannot liberate themselves from their entanglement in misery-making, quote, personal fruits of action, unquote. The impersonal or non-karma making fruits of action, on the other hand, follow those activities that are performed only to please God. When this is a man's sole motive, he can eat, sleep, walk, exercise, look after his family, earn money, and do good in the world with no resultant karmic bondage. Remaining untouched by success and failure, he always enjoys the blessing of peaceful conscience. Yeah, this is true. Principles of right action interpreted esoterically. A deeper interpretation of this stanza can also be given all beginners in the path of meditation are partially tied to the activity and distractions of the senses when they try to go deep into divine communion. This unsatisfactory state is called spiritual activity or non-activity. Not idleness merely, but an activity that is not productive of spiritual progress is, quote, non-activity, unquote. The persevering yogi succeeds in rising above the sensations of the body and directs his consciousness between the lumbar and the medullary centers until he reaches the Christ consciousness center between the eyebrows. Sometimes the yogi, free from all sensory activities and feeling a state of great joy, experiences a sense of inactivity, a lack of desire or for further progress. Any yogi who is satisfied with this state of sattvic joy does not try to reach the cerebral region to perceive there the infinite bliss of final liberation. Therefore, the Gita is advising the yogi to continue on the highway of meditation without being attached to the wayside joys and powers. The determined yogi does not become engrossed with any minor state of intuitive joyous perceptions, but goes on developing until he reaches the absolute spirit. Thus, even the highly developed yogi is reminded that he should meditate only to find God and to win his divine approval, and not to satisfy any latent egotistical desires for spiritual powers and phenomenal experiences. When a person becomes interested in a particular phase of the ever-changing motion pictures of life, even those of a spiritual nature, he remains limited. But when he watches all motion pictures of life to learn the divine lesson in them in order to find the one behind them, he becomes supremely happy and free. That's a very astute point, and something I learned just, I guess, intuitively when I was really young, was to observe people's relationships and mistakes and like make a note of them in my mind so that, I don't get caught in the same kind of thing. And it's served me very well. Continuing, verse 48, O Dhananjaya, Arjuna, remaining immersed in yoga, perform all actions, forsaking attachment to their fruits, being indifferent to success and failure. This mental evenness is termed yoga. Quote, O winner of wealth, unquote, intoxicated with the joy of divine union, perform dutifully all your actions without being attached to the outcome, whether of success or failure. Just as an invisible river beneath undulating tracts of sand glides smoothly and silently, so should mental equilibrium flow rippleless beneath all successful or unsuccessful activities. To remain ensconced in even-mindedness during all states of activities is yoga. He who can preserve in himself this mental balance in every kind of changeful circumstance is a yogi. The word yoga signifies the perfect poise or mental evenness that is the result of communion of the mind with spirit. Yoga indicates also the spiritual technique of meditation through which one attains union with spirit. Yoga signifies further any act that leads to this divine union, performing one's actions while inwardly united with the joy of spirit. Mental evenness in the native state of the soul, the ordinary man, by identifying himself with the world, divorces his consciousness from union with spirit. The remedy for this all too often disastrous disassociation lies in the performing one's actions while inwardly uniting with the joy of spirit. God's consciousness is perpetually in the state of yoga or everlasting evenness that remains unaffected by the incessant changes of creation. Man also, made in God's image, should learn to manifest that divine equilibrium by which he can live and act in this world without being victimized by its dualities. Yes. The devotee who feels no attachment to the results of either meditative or mundane activities remains unconcerned as regards success or failure. To perform actions thus undisturbed by the results is to maintain the mental balance of yoga. This state of evenness becomes an altar for spirit. The worldly man engages in activity with his full concentration on the results thereof. Consequently, he is persistently affected by his interchanging triumphs and defeats. Working for himself and not for God, he is elated by gain and cast down by loss. A mind attached to the meager fruits of actions springing from limited material or meditative activities cannot feel the omniscient tranquility of the omnipresent spirit. The little mind of the little man attached to the little things cannot possibly identify itself with the universal consciousness of God. Yep, that is definitely true. Just as a wavy mirror cannot properly reflect the objects in front of it, so a mind whose calmness is distorted by the thoughts of success or failure is unable to reflect the unchangeable spirit. Man's consciousness, when constantly identified with material changes or mental disturbances, cannot mirror the immutable divine, whose image is present within him as his true self or soul. The devotee should perform activities with the mind immersed in God. Anyone who carries out all actions in this way is in the state of liberation. Even as the Heavenly Father works through all creation without being attached to or bound by its constant flux, the Lord's consciousness manifests in all states of creation, preservation, and destruction, yet remains unchanged. As God is omnipresent in the cosmos but is undisturbed by its variety, so man, who as a soul is individualized spirit, must learn to participate in this cosmic drama with a perfectly poised and equilibrated mind. Endowed with free choice, man has misused his independence and identified himself with a transient body and a cosmos of antithetical organized chaos. He should train his mind away from restlessness to the perception of changelessness. The ordinary individual, through restlessness, perceives only the tumultuous universe. The man, following the art of yoga, inner calmness, perceives the immanent, transcendent, ever tranquil spirit. Let me go read that again. The man following the art of yoga, inner calmness, perceives the immanent, transcendent, ever tranquil spirit. The spiritual aspirant should counterbalance his restlessness, producing material activity, by calmness, producing spiritual meditation. He should learn to perform material duties as well as meditation with a mental evenness that does not look for material or spiritual gain and is not disturbed by material or spiritual failure. No material or spiritual activities performed with attachment, mental unevenness, can produce lasting happiness. The bogey, or the man of attachments, reaps unhappiness. There you go. That's where the bogeyman must come from. A yogi, whether engaged or not in outer activities, feels the unending, ever-new joy of spirit. Man is a walking God. No human being should behave like an animal identified with his lower nature. He should manifest his true divine self. The Lord works in all creation with undifferentiated poise. The man who learns to perform all activities with inner balance, without attachment to anything and without restlessness, remembers his true self and reclaims his oneness with God. The only way one can permanently establish himself in the inner evenness of yoga is by meditation. So the words of Krishna to Arjuna are particularly significant to the meditating devotee. And a yogi practicing meditation who is impatient or easily disturbed by the seemingly meager and slow results of meditation is acting with a selfish motive focused on the fruits of his actions. Yes, this is a very important point. He should meditate only with the thought of pleasing and loving God, then yoga or divine union with the immutable spirit is sure to follow. And yes, it does take some time, and it depends on who you are, and it depends on where you are in your life and how ready you are for these things, and how let's say, how willing and are you, or is a person able to throw themselves towards these kinds of things? Because it's a challenge, right? You have to actually constantly, almost in a way, you have to look at yourself in a critical way that you're not used to doing, and that's part of, like, sort of the, how some Christians leave Christian church and they call it, and then they say they're deconstruction or deconstructing themselves, that kind of thing, which I think is so interesting, that Christians moving away call it deconstructing themselves or whatever else, when in the reality of it is that's what they should have been doing the whole time. If only we had gotten, the proper spiritual heritage that we should have probably gotten from Christ, considering all the craziness that happened in early Christianity. And it's so fascinating to see that, and it plays itself out in Hinduism just as much as it does anything else. So like I mentioned earlier, these same things happen. They have these great ways of hooking people up, and then suddenly, boom, priest class comes in and is like, nope, you got to do this, you have to do that, and blasphemy this, and you're going to go whatever, and becomes mind control instead of liberation. Which, isn't that fascinating, right? I mean, how is that not a play between ego and spirit, right? Even within the actual institutional religions themselves, there is this play between their egotistical kind of control, materialistic ideas of, ritual and everything else like that, and then you have the other spiritual side that's sort of like, it's fascinating, but it's right in front of your face, right? I mean, it's again one of those, another example of this whole as above, so below type of deals. Because as they do that and they push all these things, and then other people kind of below them, then perpetuate it, and then it eventually dissolves into something else. Again, the whole idea of creation, sustaining, destruction, or dissolution, playing itself out over and over again. So there is something to these books, So it's pretty interesting stuff, and I think so worth reading and taking this and applying it to other scriptures. Because the way that he, looks into these things is definitely not what I'm used to reading from other people. So, and yes, so verse 49, ordinary action performed with desire is greatly inferior to action united to the guidance of wisdom. Therefore, O Dhananjaya, Arjuna, seek shelter in the ever-directing wisdom. Miserable are those who perform actions only for their fruits. All men go astray in the dense shadowy forest of activity except those who are guided by their inner discrimination. Therefore, O devotee, seek protection from the darkness of error by keeping the lamp of divine remembrance ever burning to light the way. Miserably lost and disillusioned are those who wander in lightness and groping for ever elusive fancy treasures of lasting happiness. And that's interesting too, because I believe Christ says something about, if you light a lamp, you're not going to hide it under a table, but you'll put it on top for all to see, right? It's the same idea being expressed here. Excuse me, I need to cough. Oh man, I got the Rona. Just kidding. Activity motivated by material desire are an inferior way of fulfilling life's duties. They entangle the doer in a tight net of ever-growing desires that must be worked out in subsequent lives. Actions, guided by the soul's inner intuitive discrimination, buddhi yoga, are instituted only to satisfy the cosmic plan and therefore leave no traces of misery-making karma. The devotee should never act in a desultory way, The devotee should never act in a desultory way, driven by whims, moods, and habits, or by the customs and fashions of the environment, or by inherited or prenatal desires. He should place all his activities under the shelter of the God-directed wisdom that is felt in meditation. Any action done with the inspiration of God does not in any way bind the performer with the cords of results. When the devotee acts under the inspiration of God, it is the Lord who is responsible for those activities, just as the father is responsible for an obedient son. Excuse me. In Intelligence that is guided by egotistical motives is liable to error, but wisdom guided by God consciousness can never make mistakes. The ordinary individual, ignorantly performing actions with the desire for earthly results, wanders through ages in the dark abyss of reincarnations. The yogi follows to freedom the path of action that is illumined by the inner light of true wisdom. As a mule carrying a heavy bag of gold does not profit by it, but only suffers under its weight, so does a rich miser suffer through the burden and responsibility of possessing wealth without having any benefit from it. As miserly people are only conscious of the weight of responsibility of possessing riches, so people who are prodded by their desires work incessantly with their minds weighted down by the desire for worldly results, wishing for more and more without being able to know true joy. The devotee is counseled to live and work in the world for God and thus remain aloof from reincarnation-making desires. All devotees who work under the guidance of wisdom are free. All ignorant people who work for gain are bound to know misery because the results of actions are uncertain and transitory. It is therefore a foolish and an inferior mode of behavior continuously to work for personal gain, gathering only troubles through ever-increasing desires. It is wisdom to live and work to please God and thus remain free and divinely content. Verse 50. One who is united to cosmic wisdom goes beyond the effects of both virtue and vice, even here in this life. Therefore, devote thyself to yoga, divine union. Yoga is the art of proper action. That is the end of verse 50. That exalted one who, by ecstatic meditation, has united his consciousness with the universal omniscience remains no longer imprisoned by the judgments of karmic law. In this very life, the prison bars of karma and desires, the effects of ego-instigated good and evil actions, are removed. Therefore, O devotee, strive above all else to become immersed in constant divine union. In oneness with the transcendent wisdom of God, perform all your actions. To work united with God is the greatest art to be mastered in this world. To carry on all activities with God consciousness is the supreme yoga, Nirvikalpa Samadhi Yoga. When a man is identified with material life, owing to a false consciousness of himself as the doer of actions, he is bound to reap the good and bad results of his prenatal and postnatal actions. But when he becomes one with omnipresent wisdom, he possesses immunity to the limiting good and bad influences in the prison house of earthly life. He feels not the ego, but God working in all his actions. Pardon me while I sip. To earn money in difficult times, to create anything unusual in this world, to invent new things, to attain great skill, these achievements are laudatory, but when a person's actions are performed solely with the consciousness of God, he has become a specialist in the greatest art of all. To carry on life's activities with God consciousness is called the supreme art of proper action because it totally frees the soul from the earthly bondage of karmic effects of actions and ensures permanent freedom in spirit. A prisoner who serves his time rebelliously is not set at liberty until he has worked out his full term, but a prisoner who works to please the warden by right action and behavior may find himself quickly paroled. Similarly, men who labor in this world, guided by the rebellious desires, find themselves long imprisoned in misery, while those who work only to please God find themselves quickly liberated. The supreme art of action, which totally frees the soul from karma. The ordinary individual, in everything he does, is wholly identified with the body, its sensations, and the multiple desires, a pattern after its sensations. Yes, when such a man dies, he takes with him from this world his unfinished longings and karmic debts. Must recompense being due, he has to come back again. And this whole idea that they just said in this paragraph with coming back and having unfinished longings and karmic debts, that's succinctly described in the book Journey of Souls, in which I did a audiobook. If you guys haven't heard that one yet, then at some point you should definitely even get a copy for yourself, or you can check out the audiobook that I did, or there's another one, a more professional one online that you can look up. It's, I think, less time. But yeah, I mean, what they're saying here is exactly explained in this book within the spirit world. You know, your spirit definitely has these things it's dealing with, and it's fascinating the way that it breaks it down, and the way he breaks this down as well. So just throwing that out there. Continuing, in this state of ecstasy, the false consciousness of the ego as a doer is dissolved. Hence, the vanished ego's prenatal seeds of good and evil actions implanted in the brain wither away, not finding any egotistical consciousness as soil on which to grow. Yoga, or union with spirit, is the only way to evade being swept along in the flood of the effects of good and evil past actions. Being otherwise unable to stem the karmic tide, the devotee should seek refuge by meditating on the oneness of the little self with the Almighty Spirit. The expanded consciousness is thereby rendered invulnerable. The flood of action sweeps past without affecting it. The effects of past actions cannot impress themselves on a God-tuned ego. Yoga is thus spoken of as the art of preventing past karma from overwhelming the soul. A soul united to God becomes God. The soul automatically disowns all the effects of its past actions of past lives. The status of the soul is changed from the body-identified, limited, and karma-bound entity to a state of ever-free, beyond the influence of karma. Therefore, the yogi should always remain concentrated at the Christ consciousness center between the eyebrows, feeling the omnipresent joy of God even while attentively performing dutiful actions. When he is able to do that, he knows the greatest art of action and is a true yogi. Bhagavan Krishna's instructions to the highly advanced disciple Arjuna concerning divine union expresses the ultimate state to be attained, though unbroken continuity in God consciousness while yet performing all of life's exacting duties, nirvikalpa samadhi, is not quickly attained by even the veteran devotee, yet every moment of deep meditation spent in seeking union with God, every effort to practice even-mindedness and renunciation of desires for the fruits of actions, brings its reward, removing sorrow and establishing peace and joy, and mitigating karma and lessening errors in decisive actions by greater attunement with God's guiding wisdom. Let's see here. As advised by the Gita, in serious spiritual endeavor, the blessings and guidance of the Guru are essential. The true disciple follows with great devotion the sadhana, the path of spiritual discipline and yoga technique of meditation, and there are sadhanas of all kinds, given by the Guru. Through this sadhana, his Guru invisibly helps him to attain the successively higher steps in the art of divine union. The disciple who daily and deeply practices his spiritual exercises and advances in a path may find the Guru appearing visibly on the astral plane to guide him onward. With the help of the Guru, all the screens of ignorance in the true disciple are burnt away, revealing to him the indescribable glory of the inner world of soul and spirit. Okay, I think it's going to be time for a break, partly because I need one real quick, and also because it started raining, so... Hopefully, I doubt by the end of the break it'll be over, but you guys might hear some raining sounds. So I'll put some calming kind of Indian style music on for y'all to enjoy. And I'll be back in between 5 and 10 minutes for another hour and a half. So let's see here. There you go. That's the break screen. And voila. See you guys in just a little bit. And we're back. You may hear a little pitter patter of rain. I'm going to just try to talk right over it. So, we'll see how that works out. Turn that off. There we go. Okay. All right, verse 51. Let me just make sure I can hear myself. Yes, indeed. Okay. So, verse 51. Those who have mastered their minds become engrossed in infinite wisdom. They have no further interest in any fruits of actions. Freed thus from the chain of rebirth, they attain the state beyond sorrow. The reward for performing all actions with a God-tuned mind, desireless with the discrimination unruffled by emotion, is freedom from the fetters of rebirth, liberation from all forms of misery-making evil. The purpose of God's plan for man is not an endless series of rebirths. The divine scheme is to afford man countless opportunities to use his free choice and discrimination to distinguish between body and soul, to forsake the miserable life of the senses by reclaiming his true identity and spirit. As soon as man discovers the true purpose of existence, he has made the first step towards salvation. He understands that he is not compelled to reincarnate again and again. By performing in this one life all actions with the consciousness of God, he can win the final liberation. God had planned to liberate the human soul after a short wisdom experience on this earth. Through misuse of his free will, however, man became earthbound, involving himself needlessly as a prolonged series of incarnations, i.e. the fall, right? Human misery is not part of God's plan. The unhappy man is simply the one who is out of touch with the Lord. God has gone to considerable trouble to produce this drama of life. It hurts him when we miss the whole point and wear a long face. Verse 52. And that is actually expressed also in the Course of Miracles book as well, which is very similar to this in Buddhism and Shaivism as well. So, verse 52, when thine intelligence penetrates beyond the darkness of delusion, then wilt thou attain indifference regarding matters that have been heard and matters yet to be heard. The end of the verse. A yogi whose discriminative intelligence is fixed in the infinite wisdom becomes impervious to delusive feelings of the delusive senses, no longer influenced by their fallacious past counsel and promises, nor will he be susceptible to their wily lures in future. He acts in the dualistic dream drama without attachment, his wisdom unattained by emotion, free of haunting desires past or future. The deluded man, habitually compelled by the inner voice of the sense mind, sorrows about unaccomplished experiences of the past and is greedy for future satisfactions. In contrast, the advanced yogi who has routed the egotistic desires and inclinations from his mental castle and reestablished the wisdom rule of the soul is impervious to past fears and future hopes. The ordinary person is bound like a prisoner in a dungeon. His life experiences are narrowly confined to the dismal realm of the senses. The advanced yogi, on the other hand, is so overwhelmed by having contacted the surprise of all surprises, the ever-new bliss of God, that he becomes indifferent to all thought of sense pleasures. His mind is no longer disturbed either by memories of past sense joys or by daydreams for the future. He is conscious only of glorious omnipresence and its everlasting joy. The man who does not meditate is indifferent to the soul because he does not know any better, but the yogi is indifferent to the senses because he knows them too well. The devotee who has known both sense inclination and the soul bliss possesses a standard of comparison that is non-existent for the worldly man. I completely agree with that. The separative and relative qualities inherent in the sense-identified consciousness compel it to behold not the unity of God, but the multiplicity of creation. The, quote, eternal now, unquote, is split for a man into inconstant states of past, present, and future. In cosmic consciousness, these delusions of relativity disappear, and with them the illusory dreams of past sense pleasures and unfulfilled desires, and future will-o'-the-wisp hopes and promises. The yogi in blissful cosmic consciousness experiences the eternal and differentiated soul reality. The deeply meditating devotee ascends to this realization by several steps. First, the practice of a specific yoga technique of meditation on cosmic vibration, the Om or Amen. He ceases to, quote, hear the, unquote, the voice of senses as he rises above all physical sounds and distractions and concentrates within on the spiritual vibratory sounds emanating from the astral body. He must go beyond the astral music, quote unquote, and listen to the cosmic Om. Within the cosmic Om, he perceives the spirit as cosmic light. He must penetrate the light and contact cosmic consciousness. He then unites his soul with cosmic consciousness, becoming one with spirit. Verse 53, when thine intelligence, bewildered by the variety of revealed truths, becomes securely anchored in the ecstasy of soul bliss, then wilt thou attain the final union, yoga. As a storm-tossed ship finds safety once it reaches the calm harbor and being well anchored cannot drift out to sea, similarly when the discriminating intellect, buffeted by the theological opinions, enters in the beginning when the sense mind is rejected as not being a suitable guide to right action, the devotee turns to the authority of the saints or scriptures for counsel. But to his unenlightened mind, this presents a bewildering variety of ways and means, not always homogeneous and not infrequently contradictory. What a great point. In their underlying unity, all true scriptures reveal the same truths about the spirit. Yes, the Vedas, the Old and New Testament of the Christian Bible, and all other scriptures of divine authority have one refrain. The indissoluble... okay, bear with me. The indissoluble... let's see here. Indissoluble unity of God and man. I'm sorry. The seeming differences of revelations are on the surface merely caused by the racial and environmental influences surrounding the prophets. Each one is singing his own hymn of the same one infinite. Yes, indeed. when a devotee tries to understand various revelations by the limited powers of reason and inference, which are rigidly conditioned by the testimony, quote, heard, unquote, from the voice of the senses, he is misled and becomes lost in a theological wilderness. The unity of all true scriptures is perceived only through meditation, developed intuition, the all-knowing faculty of the soul. And yeah, I mean, I think this is a good point. When a devotee tries to understand various revelations by the limited powers of reason and inference, which are rigidly conditioned by the testimony heard from the voices of the senses, he is misled and lost in theological wilderness. I'd say being lost in a theological wilderness is where a lot of people are. They are stuck in the words and they don't understand these things, and they take them literally, and it takes them down these paths and these roads and these decisions, which are kind of disastrous because, and that's one of the things that, like, for instance, you have Christians that, claim to be, oh, did I just lose my place here? Oh, here we go. We have Christians who, claim to be, loving Christians and whatever else, but it's so funny how so many of them can be such jerks when it comes to things. They'll tell you you're going to go to hell, and it's kind of, and it's funny because that's so similar to very cultic type of behaviors. And let's just not be sensitive over that word, because all religions are cult in one way or the other. So that's just the way that is. But in that way, like you see people do that kind of thing. And right now, with the whole jabby jab controversy going on, and you see the same exact thing. You see people acting in this cult-like behavior where they want you to do this thing, but they will go to no ends of of insulting you in every possible way. And that's their way of trying to convince you to take a procedure, you know what I mean? Like that, it makes no sense, and it just displays just how out of control these people's minds really are and how out of touch they are from real reality. And I have a great, unending, loving empathy for those people, because they are truly building around themselves a castle of their egotistical ideas, in which they're going to hide from all things and pelt people from the walls, telling them that they're terrible or whatever else, while hiding in their little castle. It's terrible, and it's so sad to see so many people across the world just go along with this. And it goes to show you that these people at the top know what they're doing when it comes to manipulation, and they know this information, which is why they're using it and turning it around on us on a mass scale. So understanding this and releasing yourself from these things will help to see through so much of the BS that's there. And I think many people in my audience are probably, I'm preaching to the choir here, but you never know who will end up listening to something like this. Again, I'm doing this just like I explained about my garden job. This reading and me spending the time doing this is for much larger reasons than anything I could ever imagine. And I don't have any attachments to that fruit, but I know some people will definitely get something out of this and will change the course of their life, maybe. And if I can do that to one person, then everything of this is worth it. So, continuing. The necessity for the guidance of a true guru and for the loyalty of the disciple. Here again is highlighted the necessity of the guidance of a true guru and for the loyalty of the disciple who will follow the guru's sadhana faithfully. With guru-given techniques of divine communion, the devotee's spiritual intelligence grows from the sense-bound rationalism to the developed intuition of deep meditation. By following the steps summarized in the commentary of the previous stanza, the yogi attains unshakable steadiness in the realization of his true self in the state of samadhi. When he can remain unbrokenly in that soul bliss, then he is ready for the final union of the beatific bliss of the soul with the omnipresent eternal bliss of spirit. This is the ultimate state of yoga. When the devotee attains this final union, he can never fall. He need never again be parted from God. Qualities of the self-realized, 54. Arjuna said, "O Keshava, Krishna, what are the characteristics of the sage who possesses ever-calm wisdom and who is steeped in samadhi ecstasy? How does this man of steady wisdom speak and sit and walk?" That is the end of the verse. Quote, "O Krishna, my spiritual curiosity is inflamed by thy words about the ultimate state of samadhi yoga. What is that sage who is settled in this final union? Does he behave like other men in his speech and actions?" Unquote. After attaining union with spirit, a devotee's consciousness never descends. Once established in God consciousness, the devotee remains in samadhi union. His plane of activity changes. Instead of working in the world while looking towards God, he feels himself in God while working in the world. His discrimination is merged with the spirit even when he sleeps, eats, or works. He realizes that God has become his nature, his little self as well as all other selves. He beholds the entire material world as God's saturated cosmos. Even in the wakeful state, he enjoys nirvikalpa samadhi, or the state in which the devotee perceives both nature and God. To be in divine ecstasy and simultaneously to be actively awakeful is the paramhansa state, the, quote, royal swan, unquote, of the soul floats in the cosmic ocean, beholding both its body and the ocean as manifestations of the same spirit. Verse 55. The Blessed Lord replied, O Partha, Arjuna, when a man completely relinquishes all desires of the mind and is entirely contented in the self by the self, he is then considered to be one settled in wisdom. End of quote 55, or verse 55. When by the meditative and spiritualized actions of the outer or ego self, the yogi drinks unceasingly the pure nectar of bliss from the chalice of the inner true self, the inner or true self, he is so wholly satisfied by that joy that he casts away all poison honey of human cravings. His ego self is supremely happy in its true self. This being is then said to be a perfect sage, a man of self-realization encircled by the ever-protecting halo of steady wisdom. Pardon me while I take a drink. And I would just like to point out that in Gnosticism, what some people call Gnosticism, which is a misleading term at best, you have this idea, and especially you see this idea in the Cathars in southern France, where you have they had male and female prefix, not prefix, but perfects, and and it was very close to the same idea here. So in essence, they had yogis and yoginis, and unfortunately, those people all got slaughtered by the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. In a crusade against other Christians, because obviously they were, practicing something that was closer to the true, version of Christianity, and the official church at the time, with the backing of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, and a few very weak and selfish French lords were able to do that, and it's a shame, and drove a lot of those people into hiding. So that was in like the 11 and 1200s, 1300s as well. Just something to put into place there. There's a connection with a lot of these older religions, and we'll be going into that, at some point after we're done with this, again, incredibly long book. So, but we're almost a fourth of the way or a third of the way through, so that's good. Continuing, this stanza there is a play on the word Atman, the self or soul, to express its dual nature in the incarnate man. Number one, the outer self or ego, the pseudo-soul with its bodily instruments and faculties, the experiencer of the world of the sense mind without and the soul within. And two, the inner or true self, that which is to be experienced by the ego and which in turn then experiences God. The outer nature of even the perfect sage retains at least some degree of egoity, or individualized consciousness, for without this the soul cannot remain in the body but would dissolve in spirit. When by the action of the outer self or spiritualized ego the divine man attains samadhi and is able to hold on to the effects of this blissful union after meditation, even after meditation, then the ego self may be said to be ever content in the true self alone. Most people do not understand why the Gita advises man to do away with sense pleasures and to concentrate on the soul. There could be no pleasures of the flesh except through the delusive identification of the soul with the body, just as a mad lover identified with his beloved thinks his happiness descended on her and her alone. The ordinary person is like a king who goes out of his beautiful palace and becomes engrossed in sordid pastimes in the slums. He is bound to suffer from the effects of his indiscriminate actions. The wise man perceives that his inner self contains within it all bliss. He who is satisfied only with that complete joy possesses the steady wisdom characteristic of that being who has attained the final union. Verse 56. He whose consciousness is not shaken by anxiety under afflictions or by attachment to happiness under favorable circumstances, he who is free from worldly loves, fears, and angers, he is called a muni of steady discrimination. And that is the end of verse 56. The meditation-perceived spirit continues its revelation to the introspective devotee concerning the behavior or marks of a wise man. He is a mastermind, a muni, one who can dissolve his mind in God, who remains in the calm depths of soul bliss beyond reach of common human emotions. Afflictions do not distract his steady wisdom. Favorable circumstances do not rouse in him attachment to the pleasure of that condition or desire for its tempting offerings. The muni, or man of wisdom, has withdrawn his consciousness from the distorted testimony of sense mind and has focused it on the soul. The searchlight of his wisdom is thrown steadily on the kingdom of an inner everlasting joy. The divine man, finding the nature of the soul to be different from the nature of the body, does not become inwardly ruffled when troubles invade the body or unduly elated over impermanent worldly joys. The soul is not in any way identified with the transitory bodily experiences. Thus, when the ego self is settled in the true self, wisdom-paralyzing emotions cannot impinge upon the consciousness of that Superman. The, quote, worldly loves, unquote, of the ego towards its prized possessions, its inordinate affection for the body or sensory pleasures, for fickle human attachments, touch not the man of wisdom. As fear is caused by a sense of impending misfortune, the wise man, identified with the soul, never has cause for alarm. Anger results from non-fulfillment of a body or mental desire. The muni harbors no such desires. Having noted the difference in the sorrows and pleasures of the wakeful or conscious state of bodily identification and the pure calm of sleep in the subconscious state, and the untrammeled joy of the superconscious state of soul awareness, the muni, by discrimination, sets his goal above the lesser states, and through meditation permanently establishes his wisdom and everlasting joy of the inner self. Yeah, some of this is pretty heady stuff. Verse 57, he who is everywhere non-attached, neither joyously excited by encountering good or disturbed by evil, has an established wisdom, unquote. Yeah, I mean, some of this is definitely things that it's hard to wrap your head around. It took me a long time to wrap my head around some things that, some of these spiritual texts, I mean, years upon years. But eventually, I intuitively came to that understanding through meditation and just experiencing and, paying attention in life. You come to realize some of these things because there are things that are paradoxically don't make sense, or you just can't really mentally wrap your head around an idea. So it's not easy. But the funny thing is that some things that you thought you couldn't understand, or you may not ever understand, you end up understanding so much better. And you don't even realize it. It's just kind of, boom, it happens. So, continuing, I think I already read this, but I'll read it again. Verse 57, he who is everywhere non-attached, neither joyously excited or encountering good or disturbed by evil, has an established wisdom. End of verse 57. He who can glide like a swan in the waters of life without wetting the feathers of his faculties in a deep sea of attachment, who is not excited while riding on the sunny crests of the waves, nor afraid while floating down the dark currents of evil happenings, has a wisdom ever poised, unwavering. The previous two stanzas emphasize the, quote, aboveness, unquote, of the sage of steady wisdom. He is desireless, content in his true self, and free from the emotions because he is united to the ever-new joy of his inner soul nature. This present stanza elaborates that as a result of this identification with the soul, the self-realized muni is, quote unquote, everywhere, at all times and under all conditions, in a state of neutrality towards good and evil, the light and shadow pictures of creation that cause the ordinary man to react with pleasure or pain. The neutrality of the wise man is not a heartless indifference, but the conscious control and calming of the faculties of consciousness. In the man who is a puppet of nature, the mind components of feeling, ego, senses, and discrimination, otherwise known as chitta, ahamkara, and manas, and buddhi, are an excitable mix of delusion-influenced actions and reactions. Though a divine man, and I have spoken unceasingly about this idea, of actions and reactions, and where they really come from, and are they really your choices, or are they just these things that click on and immediately happen within you? And one of the early stages of my development, at least I should say, my spiritual development, is recognizing those things, and then through meditation is just sort of like diving deep to find out where they come from, and then letting them go. Because once you let them go, then your reactions then become your own, which is a real game changer for a lot of people. It's funny because it's such a small thing to change, but what a big change it is when you realize how it affects your inner self, but also the people around you and situations that you're involved in. It's a pretty amazing thing when it happens. So continuing, though a divine man of steady wisdom must live and move in a body, mind, and external environment like every other man, he has achieved what Patanjali describes in Yoga Sutras, chapter 1, verse 2, I guess, as excuse me, cessation of the modifications of the mind stuff. His perceptions are not through the excitable distortions of nature, but from the calm perspective of pure soul wisdom. So the mind stuff being thought constructs. Just as the ordinary man remains indifferent to the pleasures and pains of a stranger, the divine man learns to ignore the pleasures and pains of that intimate stranger, his body. One should try to rid his body and mind of the causes of suffering, while at the same time realizing that these afflictions are not his own. They do not belong to the soul. The soul is ever at peace. While the sense-identified body and mind ceaselessly experience the phenomenal dualities, good, evil, pleasure, and pain. That's so true. A person who can perceive the separateness between the blessedness of his soul and the excitable nature of the body and mind, and further can control the instruments of this excitability, is spoken of as one having fixed discrimination and established wisdom. Unquote. Verse 58. When the yogi, like a tortoise withdrawing its limbs, can fully retire his senses from the objects of perception, his wisdom manifests steadiness. That's the end of verse 58. The tortoise swiftly withdraws its limbs within the mere armor of its shell to protect itself from harm. Similarly, when the five senses of a yogi are withdrawn in his subconscious mind during sleep, or dissolved in his superconsciousness during deep concentration, or connected at any time at will in the conscious state by self-mastery or by nirvikalpa samadhi, that muni of steady wisdom is protected from the contact of tempting invasion of the sensory world. Control of the senses is vitally linked to control of the prana, or life energy, in the body, an intelligent electric-like medium whose instrumentality enlivens the whole human mechanism. In the sensory nerves, prana makes perceptions possible. All messages of the senses, all pleasurable and painful sensations from the periphery of the body, are reported to the brain through the medium of this life energy. In the motor nerves, prana makes movement possible. It is responsible for the activity of the involuntary organs and thoughts and will require its help to express themselves in action. Prana holds the key to the bodily dwelling and to its inner apartments of the brain and consciousness. It lets in or shuts out all welcome or unwelcome visitors of sensations and actions according to the guidance it receives or the free rein it is allowed. When the devotee's mind is identified with the prana or energy in optical, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, and tactual nerves, he is tempted by beauty, music, fragrances, tastes, sex, and other attractive sensations. The Holy Gita tells the yogi to learn to withdraw his mind and energy from the five sensory channels to attain self-mastery. If, for example, a man has determined not to eat sweets, he may not be successful with a willpower alone, but he can conquer temptation scientifically by the technique of withdrawing his mind and energy from the nerves of taste and thus temporarily banish the thought and sensation of sweetness. If a telephone is disconnected, its message is cut off instantly. The yogi must be an expert switchboard operator for his sense telephones, able at will to switch on and off his mind and life force flowing through the five message carriers of sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. If a rose is held before a sleeping man, he will not see it, neither can he smell the rose nor hear any sound. One who is in the state of deep sleep will not taste food that may be put in his mouth, nor feel sensations of gentle touch. The yogi can consciously attain this freedom from sensory intrusion. Devotee is not being advised by the Gita to banish all sensory temptations by a continuous escape into sleep or into the superconsciousness. Sorry, I butchered that. Nevertheless, at the slightest command of will, the devotee should be able to withdraw the mind and energy from any of the five senses. Eventually, undesirable sense lures lose all power of attraction, controlling the sense and attaining self-mastery through Kriya Yoga. For example, during excitement of the sex impulse in the nerves, it is almost impossible to control the mind and its desire. That is why people in general succumb to sex temptations. The impulse results from identification of the mind with these physiological sex nerves. The yogi knows the art of withdrawing the mind and energy from the procreative nerves so completely that no unwanted sexual arousal in body nor any outside object of sexual temptation can overcome him. By this mastery of the mind and life force, he wholly releases himself both physiologically and mental temptation. When the mind is identified with any sensation, it finds itself unable to understand the difference between its own happiness and the pleasures of the senses. When the yogi learns how to withdraw his mind and energy from the senses, his mind concentrates on its own real joy found in the soul contact and interiorization. The pleasures of the senses, by comparison, then seem foreign and repugnant. If a hungry person feeds somebody else, he can never thus appease his own hunger. Similarly, when a soul is hungry to find its own lost happiness, it cannot do so through the senses. All sense addicts find themselves disillusioned and dissatisfied because they are seeking happiness in foreign territory hostile to soul bliss. And this is essentially what the whole idea of, what's it called? It's called the law of diminishing returns, as they call it. When, you can do anything. You have your favorite food, you have your favorite activity. The more you do it, the less satisfied you are because of it. And that's just a fact of life, and a fact of human nature in a lot of ways, psychology. Very well expressed here, I'd say. Continuing, the Kriya Yoga technique taught by Lahiri Mayasaya, my guru's guru, is a form of the highest pranayama, the art of switching off the prana or life force from the five senses. Breath is the cord that ties the consciousness to the body and senses. Breath control is a sequel of control of the heart and the life force. Even to quiet the heart partially at will is to be able to switch off the life current from the five sense telephones. By control of the heart, the switchboard of the telephonic five senses, the yogi can disconnect his mind from the five forms of sensations. When the heart is controlled, breath control follows. And interestingly enough, I completely stumbled on this myself by accident. Like, I intuitively somehow learned how to do this. It's just hours upon hours of meditation over the years. And the breath is really where it's all at. And it's funny because breath plays a role in all ancient scriptural writings, usually in the very beginning of creation. So it's fascinating. And it's true that your breath does control your heartbeat. There's one thing, if a person is having a hard time or having anxiety, or they're really like overly excited, one interesting little thing that one can do is, if you guys can remember this, is you remember the numbers, I think it's 4, 5, and 7. So you breathe in for 4 seconds, you hold it for 5 seconds, and then you breathe out for 7 seconds. It's something to that effect. If you do that for an entire minute, right, your heart's pumping pretty hard from exercising or just for whatever, maybe you went up the steps too quick and you're out of shape. Either way, you will feel your heart slow down, and it's something you can do consciously, just as an example. But taking deep breaths, you don't have to do the 4, 5, 7 things, but just taking deep breaths a little bit. It doesn't have to be just through your nose; it can be through your mouth, because you definitely get more air through your mouth. Holding it for a few seconds and then letting it nice and go, in a long out breath or whatever else, that will bring your heart rate down as well. And these things I've taught some of these methods to friends of mine over the years that have anxiety problems, and every one of them tells me that that's what they do. Every time they start to get, kind of antsy and crazy, they do that, and it helps to calm them down almost immediately. So there's something very, 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 very beneficial to learning how to, as you meditate, you sort of slow down your breath process, and you kind of use the spots in between when you breathe out and before you breathe back in again. Those are your moments of concentration. That's the part where you want to really concentrate at that spot between the eyebrows, and then you breathe back in again, and you breathe back out again. And each time between, it's just you slowly become way more relaxed. And yes, thoughts in the beginning will invade your mind like crazy. But in many ways, you just have to sort of, if you're not ready to deal with them, try, just be like, I don't want to think about that, and wipe it off your mindset if you can. If you can't, then maybe you need to think about that, and then, let your mind guide you towards what you really have to confront, because there may be something that you haven't thought about, or some way that you haven't perceived something. As you do meditate and you are trying to connect into that thing, the closer you get to it and the calmer you are, you will start to feel an intuitive push and pull, I should say. And it definitely has a guiding aspect to it. You just have to sort of allow yourself to be led by that guidance. But, don't be mistaken. It's you talking to you, trying to remind you who you really are. So just to throw that a couple of thoughts out there. So continuing, it is erroneous to think that the unscientific holding of breath in the lungs leads to the control of the heart. Those two who try to control the mind only by mental meditations find it takes a long time for the mind to control the heart effectively. Only the science of yoga, a technique such as kriya yoga, follows the quick or, quote, airplane, unquote, route to God, since it advocates a psychophysical method by which the heart can be quieted in a natural way, causing it to withdraw the life force from the senses. In order to control the heart, one must control the body, lessen the carbon in the blood by following a non-toxic creating diet, which includes bounty of fresh fruits, and learn the yoga art of burning the carbon in the venous blood so that the heart will not have to pump dark blood into the lungs for purification. By deep stillness, the heart is released from constant work and is then automatically free to withdraw the life force from the five senses. No sensations then reach the brain to harass the mind. In the bodily house, there are actually two sets of telephones, the motor nerves and the sensory receptors. Through the motor nerves, man works his muscles, limbs, and internal organs. Through his sensory telephones, his brain receives sensations from the outer world of sight, smell, hearing, taste, and touch. A yogi at will can both still all voluntary and involuntary movements of his body, and also switch off his mind and life force from sensory perceptions. The ordinary person can disconnect his mind from the senses and partially from the body only in the unconscious state of sleep. The yogi learns that the true way of happiness lies in the art of controlling mind and life force at will, consciously. The ordinary person cannot disengage his mind from the senses when they are tempted. But the yogi, like the tortoise, can securely withdraw his limbs and mind and life force from any sensory attack. Bhagavan Krishna tells the yogi to follow the art of scientific control of the senses. An adept yogi can withdraw his mind from all sensations of the material world and can unite his mind and energy with the intoxicating joy of inner ecstasy or samadhi. In a high state of yoga, perception and deep interiorization of the mind, the yogi feels retirement of the senses of smell, taste, touch, sound, and sight into the cosmic sound Om, which ultimately melts into cosmic consciousness. This experience is one that can be understood only by those who have gone into deep state of meditation. Verse 59. The man who physically fasts from the sense objects finds that the sense objects fall away for a little while leaving behind only the longing for them. But he who beholds the Supreme is freed even from longings. That's the end of verse 59. An abstinent man, unguided by wisdom, is not delivered from the dark mental forest of lurking longings. He only outwardly shuts his eyes to the sense objects, while the specters of sense longings continue to haunt him inwardly. But the wise man who opens his eyes of wisdom and sees the supreme light everywhere perceives no lingering shadows of sensory desires. The greedy man, by the penance of physical fasting may stay away for a time from food, but at the slightest thought or suggestion of food, his partially subdued longing for it is roused and quickly revives his sense of taste, weakened only temporarily by fasting. Similarly, by physical self-control without mental self-control, the sensual man may for a while distance himself from sense lures, but his mind, constantly dwelling on temptation, will sooner or later cause him to fall victim to it. Physical renunciation must be accompanied by mental renunciation and by constant discrimination between body and soul. The royal road to safety, however, is experience of the supreme joy of spirit. Once the yogi has tasted the unparalleled bliss of God, he takes no interest in the insignificant offerings of sense pleasures. Yoga, subsection, inner renunciation for monastics and householders. In this stanza, the Gita may be said to be comparing the interior method of renunciation as followed by monks and swamis to the interior method as followed by yogis. Many monastics believe that by living in a hermitage and by not marrying, they will be free from attachment to worldly objects. The truth is that all swamis and other renunciants who do not, in addition, become yogis, those who practice the scientific method of God union, are in grave danger of losing sight of their divine goal, as are householder yogis who do not practice inner non-attachment. By physical renunciation alone, the recalcitrant mind is not convinced fully that the pleasures of the senses must be forsaken, but the yogi, be he a monastic or a householder, who contacts the supreme joy of spirit by deep meditation, not only thinks, but knows that a man is a fool not to renounce the lesser joys of senses for the supreme joy of spirit. The ordinary renunciant, outwardly forsaking the objects of pleasure, has won only the first round with the senses. The inner longings have by no means acknowledged defeat, so the renunciant must learn not only the outer but the inner art of self-defense. Water added to milk freely mixes with it and dilutes its natural character. Milk that has become butter, however, can float in water without undergoing any adulteration. Similarly, the ordinary renunciant's mind has to stay away from the diluting potential of sensory temptations. Yet the yogi who has churned the butter of realization finds himself impervious, inwardly and outwardly, to all attachments to sense objects, even when he is surrounded by them. Renunciation of the world without practicing a definite yoga technique of meditation which controls the life force in the senses is not only unlikely to yield the desired spiritual benefits, but often places the monk in an awkward, hypocritical position. Outwardly a renunciant, inwardly he is tormented by temptations. Yoga says to fill the mind to the brim with the joy of God. In that overwhelming bliss, can one still long for sense pleasures? God is thus the true royal road to salvation. Verse 60, O son of Kunti, Arjuna, the eager, excitable senses do forcibly seize the consciousness even of one who has a high degree of enlightenment and is striving for liberation. End of verse 60. The powerful senses extend their physiological tentacles and occasionally get a dangerous octopus grip on even advanced devotees who are close to escape from the dark waters of delusion. A note of warning is given to the smug and self-satisfied devotee who may have attained some spiritual advancement and a degree of self-control over his life and thus considered himself immune to the subtle lures of the senses. No one is actually safe from the predatory senses, not even the nearly perfect wise man, until he has reached the final shelter of the unbreakable union with spirit. Here's a subsection. No one is safe from the predatory senses until he has attained unbreakable union with spirit. And a devotee may long separate himself from objects that excite temptations in the senses and thus rashly believe that their inner luring activity is gone. They are quite as likely to be merely dormant, hibernating within him, ready to spring into movement under a sudden contact of suitable circumstances. No germ of evil, however seemingly insignificant, should be allowed to remain lurking within, growing and undetected. As contact with germs may not appear harmful at first because one's immune qualities hold them in check, so also a slight measure of evil may apparently be untroublesome when one's spiritual health is good and strong, but if in any way the immune spiritual qualities become weakened, the bacteria of evil are quickly aroused and invigorated and quite overwhelm the vulnerable host. Thus the wise man should introspect and find out whether his greed, sex temptation, love of physical beauty, desire for flattery, and so forth have been actually slain by wisdom or whether they are only feigning their demise. even without the outward contact of specific objects. The five senses of knowledge, sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch, and the five executive powers, speech, hand and foot movement, sexual and excretory activities, may internally be excited by mere thought. For instance, a wise man trying to overcome a particular temptation not only must stay away outwardly from all stimulating occupations and people akin to his weakness, but also must control his senses internally so they do not feed his mind with associated images that arise from the subconscious mind owing to its picturizing power or to its memory of past sensual experiences. No devotee should underestimate the formidable power of the subconsciousness, whose tentacles are more far-reaching than those of the conscious mind. Verse 61. He who unites his spirit to me, having subjugated all his senses, remains concentrated on me as the supremely desirable. The intuitive wisdom of that yogi becomes steadfast, whose senses are under his sway. End of verse 61. Scoring the tinsel luminosity of sense objects, the God-united devotee focuses his thoughts on the ever-joyous spirit. His senses soon forsake their rebellion and obey him as their rightful sovereign. Two things are required of a wise man. First, he must withdraw his mind from the senses. Secondly, he must keep the mind united with the deity, yielding only to that supreme temptation. This outer and inner control makes the wisdom of the devotee unwavering, that is, not hovering between divine and sensual pleasures. The advanced yogi finds his senses ever obedient, well trained in subservience to the better and finer joys of God perception. A man's intellect is not steady if he is the victim of self-indulgences. A sense slave's mind and judgment are persistently clouded. He passes from one error to another, from one wrong action to another, from one pitfall to another. The sage of steady wisdom exercises a good judgment in all decisions and actions, for his inner intuitive wisdom is ever united to the omniscience of spirit. And again, here they are referring to one error to the other, from one wrong action to the other. If people, especially Christians, can use this word sin, which unfortunately is described as this real imprinting thing in which will land you in the everlasting fires of hell. It's actually, especially in the ancient writings, like error and sin are synonymous with each other. So just realize that the way that Christians look at sin, they really should look at it as an error, a miscalculation of reality, let's just say. And that way, it's less judgmental, it's less concrete, let's just say. And one has the option of being able to look at that and learn something and forgive yourself for even thinking that, that you thought that this was even a reality. That's a big part of forgiveness, is understanding that we're all in this delusive reality, and one person's error is no different from any error that you've ever made, which is why God says if anyone has ever, sinned and cast the first stone kind of deal, because it's true, right? And once one understands that, you can really truly elevate your empathy and your intuitive nature to an extent where you can see where people's pain comes from and how they react in life. So it can give you the opportunity in some ways to shed a little light on something by a word or a comment or a well-placed, sentence of some sort to somebody that you make them think something that they never thought about. And then that kind of, we got to plant seeds in people's minds, right? And that's the most subtle way of doing it, is that, you may challenge something in somebody's mindset, not in an aggressive way, but in essence, you make a comment that makes them think in a way that they challenge their own thought construct on their own. And that's the only real way to teach people, is you got to get them to actually ask those questions and then think about it. And once you do, that seed's been planted. And whether they water it or not, or whether you help to water that or not, is really up to what happens. But this is kind of the subtlety of life, right? This is how you subtly change people's minds and attitudes. And, it's easier than people think it is. It just takes patience. And the idea, and you don't have any attachments over time and space. So you're not impatient to get somebody to believe in something you want them to believe in, because, or to let's not say believe, just to realize. Let's just say you want people to realize things about their lives that they may not understand or even realize, even though it's right in front of their faces. And one can do that in such a subtle way that it really does make a difference. I do it all the time with people, and I see its results all the time. I don't have any attachment to them, but in the end, life plays itself out, and it's those kinds of things in your life. The deeper you get into these kinds of things, that you'll realize you're on the right path. You're not wasting your time, because you definitely see the beauty that comes out of living a life this way and having a perception, an intuitive perception in people's lives and in situations that you would never ever had you not delved inwardly to learn that about yourself. Because once you realize these things about yourself, you realize these things about all these people. And so, it is truly, this whole idea with the truth will set you free. This is the truth that sets you free. And it truly does, in multiple ways, in every way possible, honestly. So, continuing, verse 62 and 63, brooding on sense objects causes attachments to them. Attachment breeds craving. Craving breeds anger. Anger breeds delusion. Delusion breeds loss of memory of the self. Loss of right memory causes decay of the discriminating faculty. From decay of discrimination, annihilation of spiritual life follows. That is the end of verses 62 and 63. Visualizing sensory happiness produces an increasing attachment to the feeling of attraction. Such attachment becomes crystallized into an active desire for acquirement, giving birth to crafty cravings, the pernicious foe of peace. Desire is unfulfilled enmesh man in the travails of anger. Wrath creates a distorting cloud of delusion. From delusion flows the loss of memory and self-respect of one's own position and normal behavior. From a mangled memory of one's proper self exudes the stench of decayed discrimination. When discrimination degenerates, the destruction of the spiritual life follows. Absolutely. The Hindu sages were psychological experts. They recognize the futility of merely laying down commandments and passing laws, neither of which can balk man's ingenuity for breaking constraints. Indeed. By appealing to the rationality of the human mind, the sages instead presented compelling analysis of the, quote, why, unquote, of right conduct. Pardon me as I take a sip. Okay, the subsection, titled Step-by-Step Descent of Noble Man Down the Ladder of Temptation into Ruin. In concise verse, these two Gita stanzas describe the fateful step-by-step descent of potentially noble man down the ladder of temptation into ruin. These stages of descent are the baneful results of brooding over sense lures, the psychological origin of desire and its offspring and their consequences. The sage views with detachment all external beauty, whether in the face of a woman or a jewel or a flower. He has no longings for possession. The sense slave craves possession, and as beautiful women and costly treasures are numerous in this world, so are his desires. And when he is frustrated by a non-possession, he finds himself in a state of bitterness or anger. Anger arises from non-fulfillment of desires, good or bad. Obstruction of good desires gives birth to a righteous anger. Hindrance of evil desires rouses a destructive and unreasonable wrath. Righteous indignation may inspire a man to extraordinary efforts to right some wrong. A righteous anger employs reasonable and constructive methods for the attainment of a good end, but the egotistical anger builds a man so that he becomes increasingly irrational in trying to fulfill his obstructed desires. Unrighteous anger causes a man to lose his inner balance. Through anger, many men have been unwillingly and suddenly turned into criminals and murderers and doers of sundry ungodly actions. All unenlightened men are subject to the inner or outer wrath of non-fulfillment of desires. The Gita warns man, therefore, against the blind worship of sense objects. Devotees should picture to themselves the way in which anger originates from frustrated desires and how it leads to grave consequences. The paroxysm of anger has physiological and psychological effects. Physiologically, the angry man's whole system undergoes a change. The heart action is accelerated, the heat of the blood rises, and the angry man feels a burning sensation all over his body. There is a rush of blood to the head, causing internal tension of the tissues of the brain. The electric circuits of the nerves become overloaded. Chemicals at toxic levels are secreted and circulated through the body. That would be cortisol, the stress hormone. The functions of the digestive apparatus are arrested or adversely affected. Extreme uncontrollable anger has been known to trigger heart attacks, strokes, and death. In persons who are susceptible to outbursts of anger, which they love to indulge rather than transmute, the heart and nervous systems begin to weaken from the repeated emotional shocks. The beautiful face of man, wherein wonderful peace-giving emotions can be registered, undergoes ugly contortions in the angry man. And interestingly, this is a very distinct explanation of what the flight or fight response is in the human body, right? This is exactly what happens. And that's a scientific terminology for the exact same thing. The physiological effect of anger is equally acute and spiritually lethal. It stupefies the mind, anesthetizing its functioning power. At this stage, strong motor impulses of anger are very apt to overrule the rational guidelines set by the normal psychological state. The motor area of the angry man will react more quickly than the anger-dulled psychological reason. The motor impulses of anger, eager for an outlet, gush forth in channels of irresponsible activities leading to the gravest consequences. A man who in his sane moments could never dream of injuring anyone may become abusive and violent under the motor paroxysm of anger, before the person realizes the dangerous magnitude of his actions. Before his mind realizes the gravity of his heinous act, the motor impulse has done the deed. Thus, the Gita warns that anger gives birth to an enveloping delusion, a state of psychological blindness that spreads through all the reasonable faculties. It overclouds the mind and makes it grope aimlessly. In the normal state, one knows what he ought to do. The light of reason is present to guide the man of normal consciousness. But as soon as the thunderbolt of anger extinguishes that light, the angry man is left in the darkness of delusion without a guide and doesn't remember what he is supposed to do. Thus it is said that loss of memory follows delusion. Under the hypnotic influence of delusion produced by anger, a man loses his memory of what he was and how he should behave according to what is becoming to his inner real nature. The memory of his normal feelings and good sentiments fades. Under continued darkness, the angry man's memory of himself and his good qualities become chronically confused and utterly forgotten. Reasonable thoughts find no means of expression in an angry person. Reasonable words have no effect because they are directed not to the real man but to the angry self, who, from confused memory, has lost the consciousness of his true self. Confused memory is utterly incompatible with discriminative reason. With discrimination lost, the way of destruction is speedily paved. An example: a man who is cheerfully driving a car on the way to a picnic ground is suddenly requested by his wife to change the destination to go instead to the house of his mother-in-law. His joy changes to anger. I choose this particular example in full confidence that it possesses a fairly wide applicability. Excuse me. In ordinary cases, the result is either that the husband refuses to change the destination, or more commonly, that he fumingly complies with his wife's demand. In either case, anger has disrupted the harmony of the day. Sometimes, however, in the case of a violent-tempered man, the initial anger leads to tragedy. His wrath affects his memory. He may have temporary mental blocks of his recall of safe driving habits, or he fails to exercise his customary caution about other vehicles on the road. Result: an accident, sometimes fatal. Anger and its evolutes freeze the steering wheel of the car of life and stop it from reaching its material and spiritual destination. The evolution from sense attractions to destruction may thus be summarized as follows. Sense attractions, if not sublimated in the beginning, are bound to grow into desires. Obstruction of desires agitates the calmness of the consciousness and rouses a blinding confusion in the normally working mind. When this obscuring fog arises in the average man, he loses memory of his own human dignity. The loss of memory confuses and blocks his discrimination, the motivating force of all right action. When the steering wheel of discrimination in the mental car of man's life is broken, he ends up in a ditch of misery. And the next subsection is titled, Society as a whole is also subject to degradation through the same process as individuals. All the foregoing concerning the ordinary man and his material desires is pertinent also to the yogi and his encounters with what are sometimes more subtle entrapments. Even he who has progressed far on the spiritual path may suddenly find some sense attraction catching hold of his consciousness. Immediate action by the discrimination and self-control applied towards stronger spiritual effort and deeper meditation will save him. But allowing the mind to dwell, quote, harmlessly, unquote, on that attraction or to feed it in any way is to invite the ensuing consequences. Though it may manifest more subtly, the course it takes and the spiritually destructive result are the same. Sense attraction degenerates into loss of remembrance of the true self or soul and its divine contentment, along with the loss of the guidance of discrimination that attracts the consciousness toward spirit. Society as a whole is also subject to degradation through the same process as individuals, who, after all, are the constituents of communities and nations. All the miseries and ghastly terrors of civilization have their roots in discrimination, which is the gradual ripening of the evil that sprouts unwittingly in the minds of man through the stages of attraction and attachment, longing and desire, anger and passion, delusion and recklessness, and impropriety from loss of memories of man's true divine self. Wow, doesn't that explain what's going on right now, on a major scale? Thus does yoga adjure man to maintain an iron grip on the thought system of his mind. Self-control must not be lost even at the greatest provocation. When evil exists within, then what appears without is its double. He who conquers the mind conquers the world. Indeed. Verse 64, and what time is it? Okay, some time. Verse 64, the man of self-control, roaming among material objects with subjugated senses and devoid of attraction and repulsion, attains an unshakable inner calmness. That's the end of verse 64. When the spiritual warrior, armored with self-control, passes over the dangerous territory of tempting objects with a band of disciplined, obedient sense soldiers guiding them around the snares of attraction or aversion by strong commands of discrimination, he is secure in an inner joyousness that is confident of victory. The man of self-control who finds his senses under the full control of the soul's discrimination abandons attraction and aversion, the root cause of entanglement in material objects, using his obedient, unprejudiced, unentangled senses to perform duties rightfully and joyously. Just as a rich man who succumbs to flattery and temptation loses his money and health, so any man inherently rich in his soul, when lured by the sense inclination, loses his wealth of peace and his health of spirit. The ordinary, untrained, unguarded individual who wanders into the territories of temptation falls captive to sense attractions or aversions. Being thus waylaid, he fails to reach the kingdom of happiness. Attraction to certain sensations of taste, touch, sound, sight, and smell carries with it an invariable companion, which is aversion. Sudden attachments and aversions, likes and dislikes to sense objects prejudice the mind's power of free judgment and makes human beings slaves to moods and habits. Millions of men, solely through habit and lack of inner reflection, engage in quote-unquote pleasures that have long lost any real savor. Just as a man who becomes attached to a practice of the speeding of a high-powered automobile and runs it over tempting but dangerous mountain roads may swerve off the path and meet injury or death, so a man who becomes enamored in the charming sense power of the bodily machine and speeds heedlessly on the difficult roads of sense pleasures is sure to leave the straight and narrow path of the soul's tranquility. The pathway of life that every incarnate soul must travel to the ultimate goal leads through the territory of sensation and sense traps. Only the man of self-control knows how to behave in the material surroundings through which he must perforce roam and work. The man of self-control puts on an armor of wisdom and non-attachment while he performs his duty in this tricky sense world. Verse 65. In soul bliss, all grief is annihilated. Indeed, the discrimination of the blissful man soon becomes firmly established in the self. That's the end of verse 65. All dark shadows of sorrow are banished from the consciousness of him who enters the state of the soul's perfect inner tranquility and remains concentrated on the clear guiding light of his true, ever-joyous self. Verily, the magnetic needle of his mind soon becomes immovably fixed, ever facing the North Star of soul bliss. So the Sahasrara chakra above the head. The man of self-control, enjoying the immutable bliss of the soul, has passed beyond the grief-bestowing phenomenal world. Man's wavering reason, becoming fixed on the soul, changes into an unswerving discrimination. When the light of soul happiness comes, the accumulated darkness of incarnation is dispelled in a trice. The sense-entangled often find their reason jumping from one sense pleasure to another, seeking the permanent happiness that is promised but never granted by the deceitful senses. Oh, the wise man, enjoying the pure, unchanging bliss of the soul in constant meditation, finds that his reason no longer tempts him to fly from one material object to another. He is guided and guarded solely by a stable discrimination. Human reason can always find the pros and cons for good and for bad actions alike. It is inherently disloyal. Discrimination acknowledges only one pole star criterion, the soul. And this is true. The sense-entangled often find their reason jumping from one sense pleasure to another, seeking, permanent happiness. I mean, as an interesting example, one thing that happens with alcoholics that finally are able to drop alcohol, many of them tend to go to sweets because part of the alcoholism is this sugar addiction, physical sugar addiction of your body. And so I know quite a few recovered alcoholics that definitely have a major sweet tooth because within their own body, it's kind of like they had to switch from one to the other because they're, in a way, their body kind of are so used to all that sugar that it's part of that. But it's another one of those things where that people who do drop alcohol should be careful of not getting into too much sugar because it's just as bad for you. It really is. So, continuing, verse 66, to the disunited, one not established in the self, does not belong wisdom, nor has he meditation. For the unmeditative there is no tranquility, to the peaceless how come happiness. So that's the end of verse 66. He who does not remain concentrated on his true self, intent on the quality of his pure soul nature, is wanting in the divine discrimination inherent in the soul. Without this wisdom, his mind is diffused and distracted, scattered by the whims of the senses, leaving him bereft of the faculty of deep meditation with its bestowal of ineffable peace. The unmeditative man, peaceless, finds lasting happiness ever eluding him. The individual who is attached to the senses is, as a logical consequence, disunited from the soul, utterly uncognizant of its superb qualities. If one is not in light, he is in darkness. Similarly, he who is not aware of the luminous beauties of the soul is identified with the dark delusions of the senses. Identification of the human mind with the senses produces a state of, quote, disunion, unquote, characterized by restlessness, inharmony, and scattered faculties. It thus follows that the man who has separated his mind from the soul cannot manifest a true discrimination. The intellect can be cultured by education, but discrimination flows from intuition and is obtained only through soul force. Through contact with the soul, both reason and discrimination consists of a process of passing through a series of judgments in order to reach a conclusion. Reason, however, is guided by the imperfect intellect with which is full of the limitations of emotions, desires, habits. Therefore, even the highest flights of thought, the most mathematical and calculating reason, are uncertain and liable to errors. Excuse me. Discrimination born of intuition through soul contact ensures right judgment in any given situation. The soul, through the agency of intuition, drops divine guidance into the consciousness of the devotee. The intuitive guidance manifests as wisdom through the discriminative faculty to guide the intellect or reason to the right determination. Theoretical philosophers limit themselves to the development of error-prone discursive reasoning. Yogis devote themselves to acquiring unerring intuition through soul contact and meditation. Peace also is a quality of the soul. He who is not in tune with the soul has no peace. The peaceless person has no happiness because peace means abstinence of sorrow, a prerequisite to happiness. Sadness is usually followed by mental indifference, the negative state of peace. When peace in its negative state of absence of sorrow has been immediately preceded by deep grief, then through contrast, a mental tranquility is experienced, which the ignorant man calls peace. His peace is unconditional on is conditional on sadness. For him, quote, I have long been peaceful, unquote, signifies, quote, I have long been without excitement of troubles, unquote. Negative peace, unmarred by the contrast of pain, in time becomes insipid or meaningless, a state of sheer boredom. Positive peace, however, emanates from the soul and is the sacred inner environment in which true happiness unfolds. This positive state of peace may be said to be the precursor of divine bliss. Happiness is positive and tangible. In order to be really happy, however, one must first win the state of unbroken peace. One who is in tune with the soul possesses all its qualities, including peace, divine bliss, and unerring wisdom. Verse 67. Quote, as a boat on the water is carried off course by a gale, so an individual's discrimination is driven from its intended path when the mind succumbs to the wandering senses, unquote. A boat plying, that's the end of verse 67, a boat plying on peaceful waters is tossed willy-nilly and thrown off course when suddenly struck by a furious wind. Similarly, man's discrimination, sailing its destined chartered course of right action towards spirit, is helplessly set adrift when the mind yields its steerage to the helter-skelter storm of the senses. On calm seas during good weather, a boat has smooth sailing and reaches its destination without difficulty. But a boat venturing out during stormy weather will certainly be buffeted and possibly sunk. Similarly, the devotee who sails the sea of life in the good weather of spiritual habits is bound to reach easily the shores of infinite bliss. But the man of spiritual aspiration who navigates his life through the stormy waters of an ungoverned mind will surely be diverted from his course of good intentions, and may even lose sight completely of the divine pole star. This does not mean that a man who encounters tempests of sensuality should not try to navigate towards divine shores in spite of the gusts of his bad habits and temptations. The lines of this verse merely remind us that he who would sail smoothly towards spirit must calm the storms of the senses. Even a yogi who is rapidly nearing his goal may find himself amid storms of sense addictiveness through error or through past life or postnatal subconscious bad habits. Then, by the Christ power of his soul's strong will, he should command the sensory gales to subside. And interestingly enough, be interesting to pop open that part of the Bible where, he does that, right? He calms the storm. And to just sort of analytically take a real close look about the words used, the descriptions used. And I'm willing to bet there's some kind of allegorical Kurukshetra style hidden meaning behind those verses, but I digress. Verse 68, quote, O mighty armed Arjuna, his wisdom is well established, whose sense faculties are wholly subjugated in regard to sense objects, unquote. Quote, O scion of self-control, unquote, a person whose consistent wisdom is the charioteer of the stallions of the senses prevents them from racing wildly over the precarious terrain of sense objects. He guides them with a sure and steady rein over the straight pathway to blessed liberation. A man without discriminating self-control is powerless to hold the steeds of his senses on the straight and narrow path of virtue. A man who is ruled by his senses is confused. His calm inner soul judgment is displaced by the restless, purposeless habits of a whim-governed, dissatisfied, sense-enslaved mind. Such a person can never have peace. The aspiring yogi must keep the stallions of the senses under his full control. The driver of life's chariot is not counseled to tie up his sense stallions and consign them to inactivity out of a fear that they might run wild. That would be unwise. All that is necessary is to train his steeds that they remain obedient and allow him to make all decisions. Quote, Wherefore, if thy hand or thy foot offend thee, cut them off and cast them from thee. It is better for thee to enter into life halt or maimed, rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into the everlasting fire, unquote. Obviously, that's a quote from the Bible. When Jesus urged, quote, if thy hand offend thee, preventing thee from entering into God's kingdom, quote, cut it off, unquote. He was not advising literal dismemberment, but rather the severance of the impulse that had actuated it to do evil. So, yet again, here we have another example with the New Testament giving a very similar idea, right? If thy hand cut it off, or if thy foot offend thee. I mean, this is essentially talking about the sense, attributes of life, and I mean, it's so interestingly, you have, theologians throughout time that completely miss something like this, or it's just completely misunderstood. Just like that whole line of "Be wise as serpents and as pure as doves." I mean, I've yet to see like a good, accurate theological representation of what that truly means. I think almost everything I've ever seen of it has been completely wrong, because they are taking their idea of what Christ is and the message as being authentically delivered to them, which I don't think is true. And I think the early Christian history is definitely a good example of that. But I think it's important to point out that, Jesus as a possible actual yogi himself, doing his thing. I mean, he's saying a lot. So that's why there's so much that the Gita and the New Testament has in common. I don't think there's a mistake in that. They're different languages. It's a different way of presenting the information. But as we will see in the future, with my continuing studies on this connection with the Phoenicians and what I think is his actual parentage, interestingly enough, these people had very, very close connections with what seemed to be these religious ideas that we're studying here from India, but not just India, but Egypt as well, which are very connected as well. And I'm going to possibly do a audiobook reading of Egyptian yoga, which is a pretty big mind blower when you realize how old a lot of this stuff goes back. So continuing. Removal of a man's eyes does not destroy his desire for sensuous beauty. Cutting off the hands does not affect one's power of desire to hurt or to steal. What is needed is control of the misery-making desires that guide man's instruments of perception and action. Absolutely. I was once told about an obsessive woman thief who, in a moment of repentance, followed the biblical advice literally and cut off both of her hands. But so compulsive was her habit that she started to steal articles with her toes and mouth. The senses are mere instruments of the mind. They cannot act by themselves. It is the mind in discrimination that must be freed from enslavement. A wise man keeps his wisdom free and steady, directing his life on the Godward paths. Verse 69. That which is night of slumber that which is night of slumber to all creatures is luminous, wakefulness to the man of self-mastery. And what is wakefulness to ordinary men? That is night, a time for slumber, to the divinely perceptive sage, unquote. While creatures slumber in delusion's gloom, the X-ray eyes of the seer are open to wisdom's light. The power of Maya that keeps all beings engrossed in the wakefulness of attachment into material objects induces in saints only the slumber of non-attachment. This stanza uses as an analogy the habits of those Hindu yogis who devote their nights to meditation. When people of the world are asleep, these yogis sleep for a few hours in the daytime, when most men are awake and busy with material pursuits. The metaphysical correlation is that while most people are spiritually somnolent, immersed in the delusive dream of life, the man of realization is spiritually awake, his alert divine vision ever intent on the luminous reality behind the dark quote-unquote night of Maya. People who are engrossed in matter use all wakeful hours to pursue their goals. Realizing the wasteful, foolish lives of such men, the yogi remains in a slumber of indifference towards worldly concerns. The yogi whose whole attention is fixed on God withdraws himself from the world, undergoing a state of spiritual, quote, somnambulism, unquote. He is in the world, but not of the world. Seeing, the yogi sees not, cares not. Though physically awake in the world, the yogi is spiritually asleep in the oblivion of non-attachment. Thus, it can be said that the whole worldly man is alive or awake in material pursuits and asleep in spiritual matters. The yogi, in contrast, is spiritually awake and materially asleep. The worldly man is asleep in ignorance, and the yogi is awake in wisdom. The wise man is slumbering in indifference, while the average man is awake in pursuing matter. The sense-hypnotized man sees nothing but the world and is unable to perceive God. The wise man wakefully enjoys the presence of God in all things. The Gita does not literally mean that all yogis should sleep during the day and remain awake at night, nor that all worldly people should labor at night and join the yogi in the daily slumber. A fine topsy-turvy, quote, Alice through the looking glass, unquote, world we would have then. The yogi does not achieve his goals just by remaining awake at night. He must practice meditation and lead a life of self-discipline, service, and active kindness to all. A worldly man, busy during the day with reasonable material duties, should slumber at night, but should use some part of the quiet hours to meditate and to devote himself to spiritual duties. Little sleep suffices when the habit of meditation is well established. True yogis, perceiving the indestructible omnipresence, the true reality, automatically remain indifferent to the delusive appearances of material unreality. People should not remain engrossed in impermanent material pleasures, oblivious of the everlasting blessedness hidden in the soul. Nor should the yogi, indifferent to material desires, neglect to perform his worldly duties. The yogi who loves God can never forget him just because of outward activities. An unselfish man pursuing material duties with the constant remembrance and perception of God is not asleep in ignorance, but is ever awake in him. Non-activity is far from God consciousness. The lazy man bound to flesh is not free. He is not a yogi. The materially active man, ever fixed in the inward peace, is not a worldly man, but one united to God. He is a true yogi. The sincere devotee loves God deeply, whether he is non-active and silently meditating on God, or in the midst of a whirl of outer activities. He is awake in God during all hours and in all walks of life. He does not become so deeply engrossed in material duties as to be oblivious to the inner state of divine bliss. To ignore the cultivation of God consciousness through being overwhelmed with material duties is man's common error. To be inactive, on the other hand, with the pretense of being quote-unquote spiritual, is dangerous self-deceit. The worldly man should lessen his material activities sufficiently to give him time for meditation. He should remember he could not perform his material duties if God suddenly said, quote, "Well, I'm so busy with cosmic creation that I cannot throb in your heart," unquote. Nor should the yogi, just because he meditates upon God, refuse to fulfill his necessary material responsibilities. Very true. When a devotee becomes really engrossed in God during both state of non-activity and intense activity, the compassionate Lord arranges for his pension, his liberation from earthly duties. But the yogi should abide by God's will in everything and not depend complacently on his promise. Verse 70, quote, "He is full with contentment who absorbs all desires within, as the brimful ocean remains unmoved, unchanged by waters entering into it, but he who lusts after desires," unquote, of verse 70. Okay, so I think this will be the last section, and then I may go ahead and cut it off for today, but I will be back tomorrow 100% to do a whole section, hopefully a much longer section, actually. So continuing, verse 70. Okay, I already read that. So, as rivers flowing into the sea, keep it ever full, but do not disturb its changeless vastness. So the streams of desires, transmuted and absorbed within the changeless oceanic self, have no ripple effect in the Muni, but keep him overflowing with energy, contentment, and a peace that never oscillates. The ordinary man has no peace. His shallow mental reservoir is constantly roiled by the inrush of sensory stimulation. Restlessly he bores holes of desires in the dam of consciousness, draining away his inner powers and contentment. This stanza was a favorite with my great master Swami Sri Yukteswarji, and was often quoted by him. He would experience some new manifestation arising from his vast inner ocean of peace, an infinite sea informed and fed by absorbing, transmuting the inflowing rivers of all material desires. Then he would express in a sonorous voice the realizations he was feeling within. His very face shone with a great inward light. At such times, those around him who were spiritually sensitive could feel my master's overflowing perception of peace being transferred to them. I often inwardly heard him reciting this Gita verse in Sanskrit, just as I used to in years gone by. When the waters of the reservoir of inner peace trickle out through many tap holes of little desires, those streamlets are greedily absorbed in the desert soil of material perceptions. Soon the reservoir and the desert alike are dry. The sea, unlike a small reservoir, is vast, ever newly supplied by the rivers that flow into it. The sea is deep, too. Its mighty heart seems quite motionless. And here's a little quote, "But such a tide as moving seems asleep, too full for sound and foam," unquote. In the man of peace, his soul is a sea of contentment in which his whole consciousness is immersed. Instead of losing that peace through the avenues of small yearnings, he absorbs within himself all the rivers of desires, thereby keeping his quiescent sea filled to the brim. On the contrary, a man who possesses a small reservoir of peace and, instead of enlarging it by self-control and meditation, lets the waters run out through 1,000 channels of harmful desires, soon loses all his contentment. Thus, the advice of the Gita: do not drain dry your reservoir of peace by diverting its waters into channels of small but ever-growing desires. The true devotee desires less and less and finds more and more in his soul The true devotee desires less and less and finds more and more in his soul a sea of contentment. This counsel does not mean that one should abandon good aspirations, such as helping others to know God. By noble desires, the devotee does not lose his peace, which gathers reinforcement by distribution. This paradox is similar to Jesus' words, quote, "For unto every one that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance. But from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath." Let me go back with that one. So Jesus spoke and said, quote, "For unto every one that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance. But from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath." Unquote. In spiritual life, giving is receiving, and this is absolutely true. Like I was talking about earlier, about how my entire perception has completely changed, even to the point where my gardening job is an act of devotion. It's an act of pleasure, and I surrender that my work and my time and the sweat and the effort that goes into making these beautiful gardens, not just for the people who live there, but for any and all souls and people who may walk by and have a tinge of happiness that comes from that kind of thing. That's something that I hold in my understanding of what I do in work, but I hold no attachments to it. I just know that, I could make something like this beautiful and walk away from it and never look at it again. But understanding that it has ramifications and effects in life. This is a big part of being able to control your mindset in life, and one of the benefits of doing things. And so sharing is caring mentions that it sounds like Francis Bacon. Well, Francis Bacon is famously a Rosicrucian who, a lot of people don't realize this, but the Rosicrucians themselves took this old ancient yoga that was understood within Christianity and kind of, held on to that information in what they would call secret societies. And unfortunately, a lot of these secret societies are all lumped in together as one big bad, kind of thing. But realistically, when you start to look into it, even the Freemasons themselves, earlier on, they were not this kind of what they've become today. And even then, like in the 1800s, the original Freemasons that really are responsible for giving the United States its constitution and these ideas, all that kind of stuff was infiltrated and fairly destroyed by the mid-1800s by the Bavarian Illuminati. And a lot of people do not know that, and it's just a blanket statement of like, bam, it's whatever. But there's a lot of interesting stuff about Francis Bacon. Sharing is caring. If you can find, if I'm not mistaken, it's Manly P. Hall's book, the Esoteric Teaching of All Religions or Faiths or something like that. There's a whole section about ciphers in which Francis Bacon is definitely mentioned in a whole section of that. So I think you'd be interested in checking that out. But either way, I digress. I need to finish this. Exactly, a.k.a. William Shakespeare, right? So continuing, a desire to give joy to others and the outgoing activity of giving peace to others bring back to the devotee a greater piece of joy, but the satisfaction of any selfish desires leaves the devotee a poorer man. Right, because the act of giving and receiving is that you're giving to God, and so in essence, every single gift that you give without any attachments for anything in return is that that is that gift coming back to you. It's that understanding. So That's something that people should think about when they do give gifts, even if physical gifts to people. And even a gift can be something like something you help somebody with, a favor of some sort. That's a gift. That can be one of the biggest gifts to people. And don't expect anything in return. Just do it because it's the right thing to do for people. And then you will. In the process of doing things like that and living like that, you benefit internally in ways you could never imagine, because you're not holding on to anything coming back to you. But it's funny that when things go wrong in life and you don't freak out and you keep your equilibrium and your peaceful state of mind, things come out of nowhere to help. And part of that is the understanding that your gifts and your karma and the things that you create definitely do come back to you in one way or the other. And you just got to let it work its own natural way through life. Again, not having attachments to the result of anything. So continuing, letting the soul peace run out through the channels of harmful desires is wrong, but reinforcing the soul with spiritual ambitions that yield joy is correct, is right. Everyone should try to become an ocean of peace by bringing within himself the rivers of joy from the ecstasy with God and from association with good men, studies of the scriptures, selfless serviceful activities, and nurturing spiritual desires and ambitions. The inner bed of one's consciousness should be dug deeper and deeper with the dredging machine of profound meditation, that the incoming joys of others and their powers of virtue and the rivers of all other sources of goodness may find ample accommodation. The man of God is constant and changeless in his joys. Like to a vast deep ocean, his mental reservoir has become expanded into the sea of the divine self. He attracts the rivers of goodness and other souls to flow into his being, all finally commingling in the eternal sea of God. That's kind of what I was saying earlier. I mean, okay, so we're at page 393. I'm going to just read on to page 400 because that's technically a third of this book. So that's the goal. After that, I'm going to go ahead and cut it off for the day. So it'll be another like 15 minutes, I guess, as long as I don't talk too much on my own. Verse 71, quote, that person realizes peace who, relinquishing all desires, exists without craving and is unidentified with the mortal ego and its sense of, quote, mindness, unquote. Let's see here. He who roams on earth having freed himself from the... He who roams on earth having freed himself from the compulsions of past desires and who keeps himself impervious to the invasions of new cravings and is no slave to the ego's mean consciousness of, quote, I, unquote, and, quote, mine, unquote, is wholly free from bondage. With the magic flute of his soul, he enchants the peace within him to follow faithfully wherever he goes. That's very similar to what I was just saying. The formula of peace given in this stanza of the Bhagavad Gita is much quoted by complete renunciants and monks whose ascetic lives are free from worldly duties. A recluse seeks peace by minimizing bodily cares and renouncing worldly possession, and by keeping the field of his mind ablaze with wisdom thoughts so that no seeds of material desires may never again take root. By perfect renunciation, he severs all links with the personal or human ego with its desires for temporal possessions. Peace is the first product of freedom from all desires. Peace is the first product of freedom from all desires. To the recluse of Jnana Yoga school, the rationale of asceticism is that even desire for healthy and ordinary creature comforts, considered good by most people, are to be looked upon as producers of evil. All desires born of the bodily contact cause endless roamings in the corridors of earthly incarnations, since one desire leads to another, like being lost in a maddening labyrinth. When a person dies without having cast off all desires, he remains tied to rebirth on earth. Hence the renunciant not only forsakes evil desires that deeply entangle the soul in the insatiable weavings of lust for sense objects, but also does away with all personal good desires, as these may also enmesh one in earthly longings. Noble inclinations and spiritual ambitions that are free of ego and selfish interest and are motivated solely by a wish to please God are desireless desires and carry no binding effects. in relinquishing past desires, lest they spread like cancer roots and ultimately strangle his peace, the renunciant also prevents by proper thoughts, actions, and environments all possible growths of new desires. He observes an eternal vigil, keeping over burning the sacred flame of wisdom. He learns also to separate his soul from his ego, the only absolute means of immunity to delusion. He who can disconnect his mind at will from the body realizes the difference between the pure soul made in the image of God and the soul in bondage to the body, the ego. A king slept on a bed of gold in a stately castle and dreamed he was a beggar. He cried, quote, "Please give me a penny, I am a hungry beggar," quote, unquote. When the queen awakened him, he sat up, free from his dream delusions, amused by their absurdity. The kingly soul, a perfect image of the omnipresent, all-powerful spirit, is similarly sleeping in ignorance, dreaming that it is a poor mortal with afflictions and limitations. When by meditation this false body consciousness or ego consciousness disappears, the soul realizes its own status as the prince son of the king of the universe. Hence, exactly how Christ kind of he describes himself as the Son of Man, right? The renunciant and the wise man therefore train themselves not to identify the transcendent self with the mortal ego and its reincarnative making desires, free from the ego and its afflictions and attachments to earthbound existence. Man inherits the everlasting peace that is his birthright. The philosophy in this stanza, as noted, is particularly applicable to the life of the renunciant, the man of wisdom who has burnt up nearly all roots of desires of his life in the past lives, and naturally inclines to cast off of ordinary worldly pursuits and positions. But to the modern householder who wants to perform worldly duties as well as find God, the Bhagavad Gita gives other counsels in Chapter 3 on Karma Yoga, wherein Krishna teaches that he who renounces actions is not a renunciant, nor a yogi united to God. By merely forsaking action, no one reaches perfection and the actionless state. To this end, my guru had said to me shortly before I became a monk of the Swami order, quote, "He who rejects the usually worldly duties can justify himself only by assuming some kind of responsibility for a much larger family," unquote. Both the renunciant and the householder must learn to be wholly active, but without desiring the fruits of action. Any man who renounces the fruits of action and acts only for God is a man of renunciation as well as a yogi. He is a man of renunciation because he relinquishes the desire to be the beneficiary of his actions. He is also a yogi united to God because he works only to please him. A devotee attendant to his health, his family, his business, and still be a renunciant within. He says to himself, quote, "I did not create this body nor this world. So why would I have attachment to them? I perform my material duties to my family and others because God gave those tasks to me. I will meditate deeply and play this temporal role just to please him," unquote. Such a man of inner renunciation is also a yogi, for he is ever moving toward union with God through both meditation and right action. By this way of being in the world but not of the world, one can obtain peace. It is difficult, but it can be accomplished by an iron will. The path of outward renunciation, complete escape from the earthly scenes of material trouble, relinquishes longings by constant discrimination and withdrawal from objects of temptation, is suited to the nature of a choice few devotees. The yogi householder who moves among sense objects must free himself from internal desires that cause bondage more real than the temptations of the outer world. A man of renunciation must remove himself from the entanglements of the outer jungle of material objects as well as free himself from inner longings for the objects he has relinquished. Then and then only, whether in the world or in a woodland seclusion, whether a householder or a renunciant, one can attain peace. Whether he is working in the world or sitting silently in a forest, the one objective of the yogi should be to recover the lost peace of the soul and the soul's lost identity with spirit. He who is wholly desireless and ego-free has realized his objective. Verse 72, quote, "O Partha Arjuna, this is the, quote, established in Brahman, quote, state. Anyone entering this state is never again deluded. Even at the very moment of transition from the physical to the astral, if one becomes anchored therein, he attains the final irrevocable state of spirit communion," unquote. That's the end of verse 72. Enthronement in the omnipresent consciousness of spirit is spoken of as Brahmasthiti, the state of reigning in the royal spirit. The spirit reigning yogi, freed while living, is never again deluded, nor does he come down to a lesser state. And that is also called nirvikalpa samadhi. He lives in the consciousness of God. His soul expands into the spirit, and yet he retains his individuality, immersed everlastingly in spirit communion. When the yogi is established in the ethereal infinitude, even if attained only at the moment when the soul slips from the physical tenement into the astral, that soul enters the Brahman nirvana, expansion in spirit through the extinguishment of ego and all desires that compel a soul to reincarnate. An omnipresent being cannot be caged behind the bars of finite incarnations. He can, of his own free will, retain a physical or astral body, but he cannot imprison his overarching spirit. Thus, Krishna tells his disciple Arjuna, quote, "He who forsakes desires for sense enjoyments, is unattached to sense objects, and is devoid of the consciousness of the limited ego, relinquishing its afflictions of me and mine," unquote, quote unquote, receives the lasting joy of God, peace, that permanent blessedness of spirit communion spoken of as Brahmasthiti, or anchored in the infinite state. One who tastes this ultimate state of spirit union finds all his desires immediately and completely satisfied for all time. He cannot possibly stoop to lesser pleasures, or even as a person having access to a store of orange blossom honey could not crave rancid molasses. Through this, his counsel to Arjuna, Krishna tells God-seekers of all eras, quote, "It is worthwhile this struggle. Attain the final goal. Drink the nectar of bliss. Never flat, never stale, always fresh and new," unquote. Krishna further says encouragingly that it does not matter when and how man attains to this state of finality. If a devotee is successful even at the very moment preceding death in acquiring the all-blessed state through his past continuous ever-increasing meditative efforts, he will certainly never again be parted from that spirit blessedness. Unsatisfied desires at the time of death are the cause of reincarnation. I need to take a quick drink here. Okay, yeah. The man who still roams in the wilderness of matter, seeking the temporary blossoms of pleasure, works out his mortal desires by reincarnation. Desireless, he finally enters the perfection of spirit. And interestingly enough, he's mentioned this a few times. The wilderness of matter, right? I wonder if we were to go back and look at this Old Testament, and, they wandered around the wilderness for 40 years. What does that really mean, Because obviously the geography between Egypt and Israel, which, give me a break, it wouldn't take you 40 years to walk from one place to the other, but it's not exactly a wilderness, right? And it's definitely not what they're talking about in those books. At some point maybe we'll get into those kinds of things, but I just want to point out that he's made reference to this wilderness of matter on so many occasions in this book, and probably will continue to. But those of you that do know your Bible may want to rethink some of these parts of the quote unquote story, as it may not be a story but an allegory for something much bigger, just like this book is, right? It's not really a war of Kurukshetra between these people. What it really is a war between our souls versus our physical ego selves. And I think there's a lot of that stuff hidden within both Old and New Testaments, for sure. Anyways, continuing, Krishna advises the devotee to keep on working for this state of emancipation even up to the moment before death. Quote, "Him that overcometh will I make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go no more out, will reincarnate no more," unquote. Jesus assures man, a soul must attain freedom from earthly desires and egoity before death in order to escape from the merry-go-round wheel of births and deaths. If this freedom is not attained before physical death, one has to incarnate again on earth. For man to tarry in ignorance is stupid and unwholesome, fraught with untold miseries. One can never tell into what abysmal troubles his ego and unsatisfied mundane desires may lead him. Strive ceaselessly, never be impatient. Once the finality is achieved, incarnations of troubles will be when light is admitted within a room that has been locked for decades, the darkness vanishes instantly. Oh, this is the actual end of the chapter, so I guess I'll just end it here, which is a nice place to end it. But Om Tat Sat. In the Upanishads of the Holy Bhagavad Gita, the discourse of Lord Krishna to Arjuna, which is the scripture of yoga and the science of God realization, this is the second chapter called Sankhya Yoga. So here we are in the third chapter. Yes, we read all that stuff from earlier on. So chapter 3, in which I will continue tomorrow, is the Karma Yoga, the path of spiritual action. And I'll just give you guys a little taste. The sections are labeled, why is activity a necessary part of the path to liberation? The nature of right action, performing all works as oblations, yajna. This is a great chapter. And it's kind of what I was talking to you guys before, right? Those daily actions are essentially offerings to God, right? They're yajnas, they're your sacrifice, so to speak. All little things that you do, every single choice, every single action in life that you do can be with this mindset. And it is one heck of a mindset to live with, because it just opens up this, I don't know, unlimited bliss and beauty, and you see just how things can grow and affect other things. So I'm looking forward to reading that. The next is righteous duty performed with non-attachment is godly. The next is how egoless action frees the yogi from nature's dualities and bondage of karma. Right, and the next is right attitude towards one's spiritual guide in sadhana, so spiritual practices. And the last part is conquering the two-sided passion, desire and anger. So, from the vibrationalist region through a cosmic rhythm of ordered activity, the spirit brought into being all vibratory creation. Man is a part of that vibratory cosmic activity as an integral entity in the cosmic plan that all creation, projected out of spirit, must evolve back into spirit. Man also must ascend through activity in harmony with the divine schema. So, and yes, and so with that, I am definitely going to end it off here. If any of you guys want additional reading materials, various other things, y'all can feel free to email me. It's just regainingthebalance@gmail.com. There are some things I won't be able to hand to you because of whatever reasons, but I have a lot of references. I got a lot of books. A lot of them are long, past their copyright date, so that's not really a big issue. But I have all kinds of references. I have all kinds of different things I can sort of, give you guys links to see what kind of connects with you, that kind of thing. And I'm happy to spend time doing that for people who do want to reach out, because I think it's important. People definitely need guidance in life, and I definitely needed guidance in life. I unfortunately never really found a quote-unquote physical guru, so to speak, but when I was ready for it, boy did it come to me, and one step after the other, not overwhelming me with this information, but bringing me a little bit at a time, going up the ladder, like I said, one step at a time, and in through my experience, I intuitively reached many of these conclusions on my own, and or I should say not on my own. I definitely was guided by something, because once I got to a certain level of understanding, I still needed the next step, and then often in life, those next steps would just plop right into my lap, right when I needed them, and I would read or absorb a certain type of thing, and then move on, and then the next thing would come along, and and it's just one of those things where I really enjoy, at this point in my life, turning all that stuff outwards towards you all, however many of you do listen to this. And I just want to say thanks so much for, joining me, and I hope you guys are getting as much out of this book as I have. I definitely would love, I'm going to be buying a physical copy of this book real soon. I may actually buy a couple of copies for the random person that comes into my life that may need one. So I could just be like, here you go. So thanks so much, guys. I really do appreciate y'all joining me on this. But so if you like the video, like it. If not, whatever. If you think other people would enjoy it, definitely give them links to that. No big deal. I know that I'm just going to do it, and it'll go as far as it'll go. So thank you so much, and for all of you in the chat, much love to you guys, and I'm looking forward to seeing you guys again tomorrow. So I will see you guys soon. And again, if you want to reach out, my email address is just regainingthebalance, no spaces, @gmail.com. Much love, and I will catch you guys on the flip side. Peace.